So if Star Trek isn't about this, wide-eyed, happy-go-lucky vision of the future where there's no want, no greed, no money, a pseudo post-scarcity. Like, if that philosophy merely might not be the kindest term to use, but merely comes out of the tragic life and life choices of Gene Roddenberry. Because again, those elements are not a part of the original series. Those elements are not introduced, until like 1987. Okay. Until the Next Generation, like the Star Trek 4 Next Generation kind of time frame. Like those things don't show up until then. Like we've said over and over again, season 1 and season 2 of the Next Generation are the purest expressions of Gene Roddenberry's control over the Star Trek franchise, minus Star Trek the Motion Picture. Okay. And so a lot of the groundwork that, and again, most people make fun of those seasons when everything, or what most people think of Star Trek, all of that foundation gets laid in those 2 seasons. Not in the original series. That doesn't mean there aren't ideals in the original series, that there isn't like I wouldn't call it a propaganda. Maybe we could call it an agenda that's in there, and that's what we need to explore. Okay. Because again, can't say it enough. If Star Trek is not about a post-scarcity future, okay, a pseudo post-scarcity future, what is Star Trek about? And that's what we need to cover here. But we can't cover that without understanding a few things at first. And that gets to what we mentioned earlier, Rosicrucianism. Now, it is highly suggestive that Gene Roddenberry was a Rosicrucian, a member of the largest Rosicrucian group in the world to this day, that being the AMORC, based out of San Jose, California. Okay. And we're going to get into some history of that to set the foundation. But I think you're going to see very quickly just how influential that Rosicrucianism is to Star Trek, and that the aims of Rosicrucianism is ultimately the, shall we say, the true message of Star Trek, of what Star Trek was really trying to get across. And despite, whatever, pseudo post-scarcity ideas that Gene Roddenberry would try to, jam in to this franchise that weren't there from the beginning, that ultimate message, or that ultimate agenda, shall we say, of Rosicrucianism, couldn't be stuffed away. Just couldn't. And I would argue, as we're talking about, the death of New Trek, the real reason that New Trek has failed, okay, comes down to, yeah, it's bad writing. Okay, sure, there's bad writing. there's stuff that doesn't make sense. I mean, they're all of that. The problem with modern tropes and corporate wokeness and, all these other issues, like I get those. Okay. There's that. But the real reason is the people writing Star Trek actually don't understand the true core of what Star Trek was saying and espousing for decades from the beginning. Unlike the pseudo post-scarcity, which was not there from the beginning, nor was the socialism, nor, like all these things, like they weren't there from the beginning, but there are things that were. And when I say from the beginning, I don't just mean from, episode 1 of the original series, whichever one you think that happens to be, whether you think it was the Man Trap because that aired first, or if you think it's Where No Man Has Gone Before, because it's chronological, through the film schedule, chronologically, that was the first. I mean, right from the cage, from the very first pilot episode that many people, for a long time actually never saw outside of, how it was remixed into the excellent two-parter and only two-parter of the original series, that being from season 1, The Menagerie, of course, with Captain Pike, that now, even even hardened Star Trek fans, like Andy Weir, as we were mentioning earlier, that Andy Weir himself, was still kind of a fan of with the show Strange New Worlds. Okay. So what we're going to get into is right from the beginning. Now, so again, new Trek, why does it suck? Because it doesn't understand what I'm about to tell you. It doesn't understand what's actually at the heart of Star Trek. And it's so provably so. I mean, it is just provably so. You're going to see by the time we get to the end of this, you're going to completely understand why new Trek fails. And it's not for the reasons, and I'm not insulting anybody, but I'm just saying it's not for the reasons that Critical Drinker tell you. It's not for the reasons that, I don't know any YouTube commentator. Maybe Robert Meyer Burnett hit at it, got close with his assertion that Star Trek is aspirational television in all the best ways. He's not wrong about that. Okay. But I've yet to hear a YouTuber hit on what I'm going to hit on with you. And again, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So let's talk, like I said, let's talk about Rosicrucianism here. Okay. I might do a write-up and have Sophia chime in here to give a broader history if I feel that that's necessary of Rosicrucianism. But to put it simply, okay, so I am, dare I say, infamous, as infamous as I have been for nearly 15 years as being a tech podcaster. I am now just as infamous, because I wouldn't call myself a tech podcaster really anymore. I'm just a podcaster now. Everybody's a tech podcaster now because tech's everywhere, right? Anyway, so what does that term even mean? But regardless, okay. I am just as infamous now for being a Kabbalist, which I have been for a very long time. And, at varying points, letting it peek out here and there. Okay. Without getting into too much trouble here. It doesn't take one long to read the history of Kabbalah and practicing Kabbalists and see where they often had to, perhaps not be so open, about their mystical practice. Now that scares some people. It shouldn't. Okay. Like it really shouldn't. I mean, hey, Christians, even Jesus tells you, like, pray in secret. Right? Isn't that in the book of Matthew? Anyway, so with that said, I have put my knowledge of Kabbalah on full display in the past few years, so I don't need to, retread my credentials there. Regardless, Kabbalah is important in this, and if we want, I can just be, general in that, like, yes, I am a practicing mystic, okay? So are Rosicrucians. Yes, that includes Rosicrucians, likely, more famous ones of the day who are still alive, like Jacques Vallée claims to be a Rosicrucian, and there are others, okay?
To understand the Rosicrucian fire, one must first drink from the well of the Kabbalah, for the rose does not bloom without the roots of the tree of life. In the eyes of the mystic, Kabbalah was never merely a religious tradition. It was the ultimate technology of the soul, a map of the emanations of power that bridge the void between the mundane and the divine. The early seekers of the Renaissance, like Marsilio Ficino and Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, looked upon these Hebrew mysteries and saw the fragments of the Prisca Theologia, the supposed primordial, singular scientific and spiritual truth that existed before the world was fractured by the mediocrity of common religion. They believed that by mastering the secret vibrations of the universe, one could ascend from the status of materialist to that of a terrestrial god. This was the search for the ancient theology, a quest to reclaim the lost wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus and the Egyptian initiates, and it is within this potent mixture of Hermeticism and Kabbalistic structure that the Rosicrucian identity was forged in the shadows. The world first experienced the name of the Rosicrucians in the early 17th century, with the appearance of the three foundational manifestos, the Fama Fraternitatis, the Confessio Fraternitatis, and the Chimical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. These texts spoke of a secret brotherhood, an invisible college of masters who possessed the secrets of transmutation and the elixir of life. They told the story of Father C.R.C., a seeker who travelled through the East, absorbing the mastery of the Arabs and the occultists of Fez, only to return to a Europe too weak and too fearful to receive his light. These manifestos were a call to arms for the intellect, a demand that the elite of Europe cast off the shackles of the Church and the ignorance of the masses to usher in a new age of discovery and spiritual dominance. While some dismissed them as a grand satire or a myth, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment sparked a fever among the masters of science and philosophy at the time, influencing the likes of Francis Bacon and Robert Fludd, who sought to apply this hidden wisdom to the mastery of the physical world. As the centuries turned, the original invisible college drifted into the realm of legend, but the tradition was claimed to be kept alive in the back rooms of Masonic lodges and the private libraries of alchemists until the dawn of the 20th century, when these currents of hidden knowledge found a new vessel in Harvey Spencer Lewis. In 1915, Lewis established the ancient and mystical order Rosicrucis, or AMORC, in New York City. He claimed to have been initiated in France by the true descendants of the ancient Rose Croix, authorized to bring the wisdom of the ages to the New World. Lewis did not cater to the timid with what he espoused. He structured the AMORC as a rigorous system of graded lessons, a hierarchy of occult knowledge that promised its members the ability to harness the cosmic forces. By the 1920s, he moved the headquarters to San Jose, California, and built Rosicrucian Park, a temple of Egyptian-inspired architecture that stood as a testament to the order's claim of an unbroken lineage stretching back to the pharaoh Thutmose III. Under his leadership and that of his son, Ralph Maxwell Lewis, AMORC became a global force, utilizing the modern tools of the age to disseminate ancient techniques of mental discipline, visualization, and psychic mastery to thousands of seekers across the planet. Understand that the Rosicrucian tradition is a philosophical and spiritual path that focuses on the study of universal laws and the inner potential of the human being. While historical Rosicrucianism and the modern AMORC share a common foundation, they differ in their methods, presentation, and specific areas of focus. Traditional Rosicrucianism, which emerged in the early 17th century, is built on several key concepts. The first key concept is the Great Work, or internal alchemy. At the heart of the tradition is the idea of transformation. While literal alchemists tried to turn lead into gold, Rosicrucians view this as a metaphor for turning a base or unrefined human nature into spiritual gold. This is a process of self-improvement and enlightenment. The next key concept is as above, so below. This belief suggests that there is a direct connection between the universe, the macrocosm, and the individual human being, the microcosm. By studying the laws of nature and the universe, a person can better understand themselves, and vice versa. Another key concept is universal brotherhood. The historical manifestos spoke of a secret group of masters working quietly behind the scenes to help humanity progress. The goal was a universal reformation, a global improvement of science, religion, and society. Which leads directly into that. The Rosicrucians believe that the universe is governed by orderly spiritual and physical laws. By learning these laws, an individual can stop being a victim of circumstance and instead learn to direct their own life more effectively. AMORC differs slightly in this. While it respects the ancient traditions, it has adapted them for the modern world in several ways. Perhaps the most pronounced difference is the monograph system. Historically, Rosicrucian knowledge was passed down through secret meetings or difficult-to-find manuscripts. AMORC modernised this by creating monographs, structured, step-by-step lessons that members can study at home. This made the teachings accessible to a global audience rather than just a few inner circle members. And while some historical Rosicrucians may have experimented with physical chemistry, AMORC focuses almost entirely on mental and spiritual alchemy. This involves using the power of the mind, visualization, and meditation to change one's reality and improve health, finances, and relationships. AMORC also emphasizes achieving a state called cosmic consciousness. This is described as a direct personal experience of being at one with the universe. It moves the focus away from dogmatic beliefs and toward personal, practical experience. And importantly, in relation to Star Trek, the AMORC often frames its mystical teachings in the language of science and psychology. For example, they might explain spiritual concepts using ideas about brainwaves, subconscious programming, or the physics of vibrations. This makes the teachings more palatable to a modern, secular audience compared to the heavily religious or cryptic language of the 1600s. And unlike the original Invisible College, which was intentionally mysterious and decentralized, AMORC is a highly organized, non-profit corporation with a formal headquarters, Rosicrucian Park in San Jose, a clear leadership structure, and specific degrees or levels of advancement. Not exactly an environment for global puppet masters. Yet, where there are even just claims of power, real or imagined, there is inevitably fear of it, and the history of the Rosicrucians is draped in the dark velvet of conspiracy theories. For centuries, there has been whispers that the Order is a sinister puppet master, pulling the strings of global politics. They link the Rosicrucians to the Illuminati, claiming they are the architects of a new world order designed to strip society of its comforts and enslave humanity. Some believe the group practices black magic to manipulate the financial markets, or that they are the guardians of a bloodline that defies the laws of nature. Even the Catholic Church, sensing a rival to its control over the human spirit, has historically viewed the movement as a nest of heretics and sorcerers. One of the most persistent legends suggests that the AMORC's founder, Harvey Spencer Lewis, was not just a teacher, but a keeper of secrets regarding a lost race. Under a pen name, he wrote about Lemuria, a sunken continent, and claimed that its survivors were living deep inside Mount Shasta in Northern California. Conspiracy theorists take this much further, whispering that the Order is in direct contact with these Lemurians, a race of tall, robed beings with advanced technology and psychic powers, who live in a hidden city called Telos. The theory claims that the AMORC's Rosicrucian Park is actually a focal point or a portal meant to attune the world to the vibrations of these underground masters. There is also a vocal group of former members who claim that the Order is not a school, but a sophisticated mind control operation. They point to the monographs, the weekly lessons, as a form of slow drip hypnosis. The theory is that by having thousands of members perform the same rituals and meditations at the same time, the Order is creating a psychic battery, or a mass mind, that the leaders can use to influence world events or financial markets. Critics like Pierre Freeman have argued that these lessons use latent suggestions to make members financially and emotionally dependent on the Order, effectively turning them into psychic slaves, who pour their energy and money into the organisation's coffers. Regardless of such claims, to many the AMORC has provided a framework for mental and emotional health long before self-care became a modern trend. Their teachings offer practical techniques for managing stress, improving focus, and developing a sense of inner harmony. Because they are non-sectarian, they allow individuals from all faiths, or no faith at all, to come together in a spirit of tolerance and mutual respect. They advocate for international peace, often publishing manifestos that call for global cooperation and the recognition of our shared humanity. For many, the order has functioned as a quiet, steady force for good, providing a disciplined path for personal growth that encourages individuals to become better citizens, kinder neighbours, and more conscious stewards of the planet. Dr. Sovryn will leave you to decide for yourself which path the AMORC walks.
Now, Rosicrucianism, much like, my people, the Jews, have this long history of, because there is so much secrecy, around the matter, they end up being a part of a lot of conspiracy theories. Sometimes these things are founded because, like Kim Stanley Robinson would famously say, you can't get 5 people together and not have one fucking idiot. Well, when you get groups together, you end up with some idiots. And that includes, despite how much mystery schools try to, through varying rituals and practice, try to, shall we say, weed out the chaff, despite how hard they may try, that doesn't always work. And, like we were just talking about money. Well, sometimes, money talks and bullshit walks, and money can talk you into a lot of rooms that you're never supposed to be a part of without earning it. But that's besides the point. So joining the AMORC, particularly as Rosicrucianism goes, is actually not like a grand challenge. Okay. Like it used to be, I don't know if it still is, but it used to be like you would do mail-in stuff, and they'd send courses to you, you'd pay for it, your membership dues, whatever, they'd send it to you in the mail and all that. And you go through this sort of thing. So it's not even like Freemasonry, even though there are absolutely elements of Rosicrucianism within Freemasonry. Okay. It's not like in Freemasonry where, you really have to like there's so many things you have to go through, and you can't like elect to join. Okay. You have to be chosen, blah, 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 whatever. Okay. It's a little bit different with the AMORC. So regardless. Okay. Let's talk about Rosicrucianism more broadly, and then we'll talk about the AMORC in particular. And then, yes, this is going to get right into Star Trek. And like I said, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Okay? So Rosicrucianism comes out of the Enlightenment. And this is, and I brought up, my my Kabbalist leanings, credentials. They're not leanings. I'm all in. I brought that up because in a very real way, Rosicrucianism is just Christian Kabbalah. Okay. In fact, in many ways, openly so, to where Rosicrucianism is like, oh yeah, we use the Hebrew alphabet. We practice Kabbalah. Of course, we might spell it with a C and a Q instead of a K when we transliterate it, whatever. Okay. So I'm in no way unfair in saying that. Rosicrucianism, again, very simply, they are trying to cross that bridge between mysticism and science and make them one again. And if you're not comfortable with saying that it's Christian Kabbalah, it is certainly Christianity with Gnostic elements jammed into Christianity. Okay. Now again, and I don't say this derogatorily. When I say conspiracy theorist, I don't mean this derogatorily at all. There are a lot of conspiracy theorists who are like, oh, Rosicrucian, Satan, evil, bad. Again, no. And I don't think that there's value in me. You can go back and listen to episodes of Sexoterica where, Mrs. Sovryn and I talk about the reality of good and evil, talk a bit about Lucifer and Satan and all these other things and what these concepts actually mean within, within a spiritual landscape, if I'm to use that term. Okay. So I'm not like, there's no value really in going back over this ground, even though Satan would have a part to play in the annals of Star Trek, particularly the aforementioned The Cage, okay, and one Mr. Spock. And it would even get humorously played with, of course, in an episode I actually very much enjoy, an episode of the original series called The Omega Glory, where, an old Bible gets trolled out and they open up the books and there's drawings in it too. Cause there's drawings in the Bible, right? No, there's not. And there's this old drawing and wow, Satan looks exactly, or one of the demons anyway, looks exactly like Mr. Spock. Unbelievable. Now, there's an irony in that. Again, like I've told you, once you see it, you can't unsee it. We're going to keep going. Okay. But regardless, no, Rosicrucianists or, Rosicrucians are not inherently Satanists, are not inherently devil worshippers. I am not saying that there aren't people who, who would claim to be Rosicrucians or descendants of such an order that do not also at the same time claim, that they worship some kind of devil or some kind of grand evil or some entity that isn't, YHWH, okay, or YHVH for those that know. There are people who do that, okay, but by and large, what's openly stated and what's more available information, which there is actually a decent amount when it comes to Rosicrucianism. Like you can read some of the central tracts, right? Like, like the works of where the name comes from, of Christian Rosenkreutz. I mean, that was stuff came out in like 1616. You can go back and you can actually read this stuff. Now you need keys to be able to unlock all of that, or a lot of the symbolism and what's being said within the text. But regardless, it's somewhat open for you. Okay. And it's Hermeticism. And again, we could spend so much time on all of that, but we don't necessarily have to do that. We're going to basically, like I said, the gist of what Rosicrucianism is, it's really just Christian Kabbalah. Okay. It's Christianity with Gnosticism, and really the term I should use, re-injected into Christianity. Now, Gnosticism is also an incredibly broad term. Okay, right? Like just as there's many different Christian denominations, there's many different Gnostic denominations. Like, what do you mean when you say Gnosticism? Right. Okay. Just like, what do you mean when you say Kabbalah? Because there are so many different practices of Kabbalah. There's Lurianic Kabbalah, there's Cordoverian Kabbalah. There's just all of these things have many different denominations. And that's why in the end, we need to focus on at least the group that it is claimed that Gene Roddenberry was a part of, and that is the AMORC. Now, this is a group who, we could say fortunately, or I'm sure many Christians would say unfortunately, is pretty open in what they believe. Or at least they have a very open face on some of these things. Because it's also a group that is not without its own internal controversy, which we might touch on that a little bit as we go through this. Okay. So, the AMORC, again, based out of San Jose, though really they have temples all over the world. They are easily tens of thousands of members, as I understand it. They are easily the largest Rosicrucian group, openly Rosicrucian group in the world. Easily. Okay. They were started by Harvey Spencer Lewis in 1915 in America. All right. Now, as far as what did this come out of, yes, like there is a lot of language in the works, okay, of, that were initially laid out mainly by Harvey Spencer Lewis, in fact. A lot of the works and a lot of the symbolism heavily borrows from the OTO, of course, of Aleister Crowley fame, which is where a lot of people, I think, get this idea that Rosicrucianism is Satan worship because they're attached to Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley, easily one of the most misunderstood, I'm not going to say good guy, okay? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying one of the most misunderstood individuals in history, right? Of course, famously known as the most evil man in the world, right? What is evil? We'll avoid that conversation right now. Okay. So, and also, you know, like there were previous Rosicrucian groups to this. I mean, in a very real way, the Golden Dawn, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which I am incredibly familiar with. They are, you know, in some ways you can see where the AMORC came out of them, because they were a very, you know, famous Rosicrucian group as well. And, you know, and would fall apart around the same time. I mean, there's an argument that, well, the Golden Dawn actually didn't go anywhere, just like the OTO didn't. But, you know, these things do wax and wane in power and prestige. And in a very real way, the AMORC seemed to be filling in a gap left, you know, by some of these groups from the later 19th century. It's also not uninteresting. I mean, oh man, there's so many weird things to get into with this that I want to go on, but we're talking about Star Trek, and we got to keep this within Star Trek. Again, you need to understand these precepts of Rosicrucianism, you know, to get where we're going with Star Trek. Okay. And Gene Roddenberry in particular on this, and perhaps other individuals involved with it. So, you know, like, I know there's probably so many things I'm saying you want to double click on, and of course get it in the YouTube comments or in the Spotify comments or the Rumble comments. We're everywhere. Okay. Get it in the comments if you have questions, and I will do a follow-up episode to cover, you know, whatever you guys ask about. Guys, gals, Z's, whatever you ask about. Okay. All right. So, the AMORC, you know, would end up becoming this very prominent Rosicrucian group. Not very secretive, like, ultimately. Now, you could say that they're doing things behind the scenes. Sure. You know, you could make that argument. Okay. And that they, you know, were trying to inject their ideas. Maybe perhaps like Sir John Whitmore was trying to, you know, was literally paying for movies to get made, hiring Gene Roddenberry to write the fucking thing, you know, to get the message of the Nine out there to the world. Okay. Again, the Nine, to their credit, were not like a super secretive group. That's why we know that story about Gene Roddenberry that we've read, that we were just reading. So it's the same with the AMORC. I mean, you can go to San Jose and you can go to what's called Rosicrucian Park. And it is actually a beautiful place. I mean, like, wow, everything they have set up there, like the shrine to Akhenaten. Of course, that's another part of, or at least for the AMORC, is they argue that they are carrying the ancient Egyptian traditions of Akhenaten himself. Now, are they actually doing that? I would argue, coming at it from a perspective that, yes, actually Kabbalah is also carrying on a degree of Atenism, which is what Akhenaten, you know, I wouldn't say he developed it, but that he practiced. Okay. You know, yeah, they actually get a lot right. Like, there's a lot to like in what they publicly espouse. Again, we're going to cover this. I'm going to break this down for you a bit. Okay. And try and keep it focused on how it relates to Star Trek. But, yeah, they have, like, there's this beautiful water fountain there. That, I mean, then there's crosses all over the place, you know, if you didn't know better, and there's also Stars of David. I mean, if you didn't know better, aside from the Egyptian iconography, because yes, there's ankhs all over the place. Like there's the Egyptian museum there, you know, in the Grand Temple and everything, and the library. There's obelisks, you know, there's a big statue of Tutmosis III. Again, it's very much visited. It's one of the most visited spots in San Jose. It's open to the public. So it's not like you don't know that they're there and they're like hiding, you know, and they got their cloaks over. Oh, yeah, praise Satan. Da, 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 da. You know, I mean, I'm the only one that does that. Here, I'll put my cloak on you. Please. Anyway. So, you're welcome to like go there. You can sign up if I recall correctly. Yeah, it's really something. Okay. Now, the one thing that might, cause I mentioned names earlier of other, famous people of the 20th century who were supposedly members of the AMORC. Like I mentioned, Leonard Cohen. I don't see that as inherently nefarious, right? When you consider that, his song Hallelujah, which is probably like the most covered song in the world. And it's an incredibly powerful song. There's so much truth, and we need to talk about this. Like, what speaks through art? Is it the individual? Is it more? We need to cover this as well in what we're getting into here. Okay. I know this is going to go 6 hours. this whole trek, this whole journey. But Leonard Cohen, like there's nothing inherently bad about that. In fact, I would argue that only somebody who is so mystically attuned could write a song like Hallelujah. It's not uninteresting also that, and I'll just say this quickly, that, there are clear allusions in that song to the character of Samson, which that should interest anybody who's heard my work on the Samsonid priesthood. But we move on. And again, as we talk about what is speaking through art, because that's also part of the conversation with Star Trek. Okay. You might get more of what I mean by that. Anyway. So, the character that would bring pause to me is Walt Disney, because what again, I say this with respect, what the conspiracy theorists have on Walt Disney are not pretty pictures, perhaps literally and metaphorically. So the idea that, that he was a part of the AMORC and obviously would be fabulously wealthy, unlike Gene Roddenberry at the time, and could have tremendous influence. That does bring pause. Okay. On all of this. And I want to recognize that. Okay. But a major goal, touching beyond that, a major goal of the AMORC, of Rosicrucianism, is achieving a type of immortality. So when you hear that apparently, again, people may want to question the truth around this, but apparently Walt Disney, okay, has his head frozen somewhere. It would not surprise that someone who did that way ahead of cryonics being something of more extreme interest that would, be decades later. It would not surprise that he was attempting to achieve immortality. Okay. Because again, that's a very Rosicrucian concept. And it's not inherently a bad one. I know for Christians, yes, if you're not getting eternal life through Jesus Christ, then if it's not that, it's the devil, by default. I know, I hear you folks. Okay. But I am just saying that in general, a person with a desire to live forever is not an inherently bad thing, and is something that we know from our most ancient of writings. Even pre-dynastic Egypt was a desire of humanity. It's always been there. So far be it for me to come out and say that's evil, whatever evil is anyway. So getting back to it, like I said, with, the late 19th century, early 20th century, I mean, you also, you had the New Thought movement at the time. I mean, you just had, especially in the later 19th century, you just had all of these religions and new forms of spirituality and everything. I mean, just springing out of nowhere. And some people would say cults. That's a value judgment that, I'll let you make. Okay. I mean, so many of them from upstate New York, which is so strange because the Nine, of course, you remember they were somewhat based out of like London and out of upstate New York. But out of upstate New York, you'd get the Seventh-day Adventists, the Mormons, Christian Scientists, all in that Northeast area. Like it's, what I've said this for so many years, on my shows that like what was in the water there at the time. Like it's just strange, all the things that came out of that area. So you had a lot of new ideas. Now, one of these new ideas was also an outcropping of Rosicrucianism and was very open, and I am a huge fan of, and that is anthroposophy, of course, by Rudolf Steiner. That was kind of his spiritual field, scientific field. I agree that it is, I would call it science as well. I'm not saying I agree with Rudolf Steiner, like on some particulars 100%, but he gets way more right than he ever gets wrong. And he was considered such a danger, that even though he wasn't Jewish, of course, Hitler, or the Nazis would say he's a Jew. Like that's how dangerous his message was to, if there were a grand evil, it'd be the Nazis. But that's how dangerous this guy was. And, you can tell a lot about somebody by their enemies, who their enemies are. And he was a grand enemy of the Nazis. So take that for what you will. If you want to argue that Rosicrucianism is inherently bad, but then, it was espoused, a lot of its precepts were espoused by Rudolf Steiner, and Rudolf Steiner was considered perhaps the most dangerous person, or one of the most dangerous people on the planet by the Nazis. Again, take that for what you will. I have conclusions that come out of that I think make a lot of sense and that do not paint these spiritual ideas that we're going to cover in a negative light. In fact, it paints them in a very positive one. Okay. So, and fortunately, Rudolf Steiner, being, in my opinion, an incredibly honest human being, and incredibly open. Like if there was an open source spirituality, anthroposophy was that before anything else ever was, before that was even like a term that you could think of. Okay. Because he wrote down and shared pretty much everything to the best of my knowledge. Now, there might be out there somewhere like secret shit that I don't know about. You know what I mean? And I have to leave space for that. But as far as I know, like we can read some of the very real deep darks, and they're not really that dark, of Rudolf Steiner, and credit to him for that. Okay. And he was very open and very clear because he was such a great writer and such a tremendous thinker. I mean, we're talking about the guy that came up with biodynamics, Waldorf schools. I mean, he came up with all of these things that are considered like almost standards in, shall we say, alternative cultures today. It's really, really impressive when you read up about him. I'm not going to do a whole write up on him right now, but he is absolutely worth exploring. And we're going to explore at least some of what he lays out as the terms and precepts within Rosicrucianism that, yes, reflects a good chunk of what also the AMORC would put out there. Okay. And because again, a lot of this comes out of Rosicrucianism, and again, Rosicrucianism is just Christian Kabbalah. And, I want to be really quick before we get into that. I want to be really gentle here because I don't want to sound like Chekhov. And I don't mean I don't mean the guy that wrote The Three Sisters. I mean, okay. I mean Pavel Chekhov. I don't want to sound like Chekhov where like in every episode, whenever they say, oh, have you ever heard of this? And he's like, of course, it was invented in Russia, right? I don't want to sound like that. It's like, of course, Kabbalah invented everything. I'm not making that claim. Okay. But if you want to ask me more about it, believe me, I can show you the through lines regardless. Okay. It's important to bring up Kabbalah because as I said previously in this, Leonard Nimoy, either openly or secretly, again, like I told you, Kabbalists will pick their times when they want to, kind of reveal their practice. Leonard Nimoy, I argue ardently, was a Kabbalist, and I feel that I have the receipts, and I talked about those previously. Okay. I could do a deep dive episode in the future if you want. Again, get that in the comments. And, I will, well, as he so famously said in the episode Mirror, Mirror, Captain Kirk, I will consider it. Okay. All right. So, so Kabbalah is going to matter in this, but really in that all of these spiritual ideas, are just all part of this larger Prisca Theologia, kind of the original spiritual system that Rosicrucianism thought that it was carrying, into modern times. Now, through Rudolf Steiner's kind of definitions and terms, okay, I'm going to use his, but again, it's still Rosicrucian. It's still within Rosicrucianism. Okay, again, he just lays it out in the clearest way, and I just want to cite my sources, unlike a lot of people on YouTube who never do, and just do a lot of copy paste and whatever else. Okay, so Steiner would be, really clear that there are actually 7 stages of human development. Okay. And we're like right now, we're actually in the 4th one. Okay. And so these stages would be, and they have planetary names.
The great Rudolf Steiner, steeped in Rosicrucian tradition, outlined a systematic, long-term process of development of the human, mapping cosmic evolution alongside the formation of human capabilities, spanning 7 distinct sequential stages. This process is cyclical, moving from an initial descent or involution, where essential components are formed, into a central phase of stabilization, and finally ascending in an evolutionary arc toward a perfected state. This entire model is an explanation of consciousness and form development, where each planetary phase provides the environment for the next necessary human component to emerge. The journey begins with 3 stages of involution, focusing on forming the foundational vehicles of life and consciousness from cosmic rudiments. The first stage, termed Old Saturn, was primarily about seeding the initial physical rudiments, which existed in a state akin to a deep trance consciousness driven by pure will. The following stage, Old Sun, developed the etheric, or life, body, which is responsible for metabolic functions, growth, and a dreamless sleep state of consciousness. The third stage, Old Moon, introduced and developed the astral, or soul, body, the seat of emotions, sentiments, and desires, operating within a dreamlike picture consciousness. This process culminates in the 4th and current phase, Earth, which serves as the critical turning point in the entire developmental cycle. At this stage, self-consciousness, or the I, ego, is fully developed. Humans are now endowed with objective perception and the potential for individual freedom. This stage marks the end of the involutionary descent of components and begins the process of self-directed transformation and evolution. A pivotal cosmic event, identified as the Christ impulse, occurred within this stage to enable this specific individualization and subsequent self-directed development. The central task of the current human ego is to begin transforming the previously received lower bodies. Following the Earth stage, the developmental path turns toward evolution, or the ascent, where human effort will focus on spiritualizing the previously formed components. The 5th stage, future Jupiter, is dedicated to spiritualizing the astral body into the spiritual self, which will result in higher imagination, intuitive thinking, and genuine brotherly love. The subsequent phase, future Venus, will involve the spiritualization of the etheric body into the life spirit, which will produce higher inspiration, true freedom, and a global community. Finally, the entire developmental sequence reaches its culmination in the 7th stage, which Dr. Sovryn will reveal its name shortly. This ultimate, 7th state is achieved through the total perfection of the physical body itself, the oldest and densest component first seeded on Old Saturn, transforming it into the Atma, spirit man. This results in the highest possible creative consciousness, where humanity, having mastered will as a direct spiritual power, evolves into the ultimate state of becoming co-creative agents, or gods, themselves. The whole process is therefore a journey from unconscious potential through a stabilization into self-aware freedom, and finally to an active, powerful, and creative spiritual perfection.
You want to venture a guess at what the name is of number 7? I know what you're thinking, like, oh yeah, they're all named after planets, so maybe it's New Saturn, or maybe it's Neptune, or it's Mars, or something like that. Like, what do you think is the 7th, the ultimate level of spiritual evolution, where you completely ascend? Your spirit and body become, like just this harmonious, resonant energy that is a co-creative process within the universe. What is that called? Because I know what you're wondering. Brian, what the fuck does this have to do with Star Trek? So what if Gene Roddenberry was a Rosicrucian? What does this have to do with Star Trek? How could this possibly mean anything for Star Trek? None of this shit makes sense. There's more than 7 planets. Depending upon who you ask, of course. If you ask Sumerians, different story. But anyway, there's more than 7 planets. What the fuck is this, Brian? What is the ultimate evolution according to the Rosicrucians? What do you call that? If every other one is named after a planet, it's got to be a planet. What planet is it? If it's not Earth, I can't believe it's not Earth. What the fuck is it? Let me tell you what it is. Vulcan. And the crowd goes crazy. The ultimate evolution of the human being is called Vulcan. Now, why is this? Why is this named after, like this Roman fire god? Now, we need to do a little more history here, okay? Because Vulcan is not just, this Roman volcano god, okay? Who, of course, is really the counterpart to the Greek Hephaestus. There's importance to that. There is tremendous importance to that. But that's not where we need to start. Okay, where we actually need to start is an understanding, and I know a lot of people might not be aware of this. There was a hypothetical planet in our solar system that basically, based upon, the works of Newton. Okay, so we're talking pre-20th century scientists were constantly on the hunt, and it was a hunt, okay, for this planet that must have been, by classical physics, that must have been between the sun and Mercury. Okay. And, you can imagine that something, a planetoid that existed in that orbit, based upon what we know of Mercury, what, hellish landscape that must have been. Okay. Now, for Star Trek aficionados and sweaties, you're instantly imagining, from the aforementioned Star Trek the Motion Picture, you're instantly imagining what Vulcan often looks like, or even from like Star Trek Enterprise, where it seems to be this almost complete desert planet, right? Of course, in Star Trek the Motion Picture, the planet Vulcan is, there's like flames everywhere, like it looks like lava lakes and these giant stone structures. Like it is a hellscape, which admittedly also adds to the, shall we say, the demonic air that NBC executives had a problem with, with the character of Spock and with the Vulcans in general. Again, all of that needs to be touched on, and we'll get to that. But, so, starting in, not uninterestingly, okay, and this, I think, just shows how far back this evolutionary concept, this human evolutionary concept, this alchemical Rosicrucian concept of Vulcan, okay, it's not uninteresting that basically the the theoretical idea, or the hypothesis, I should say, that there's this planetoid in our solar system between Mercury and the sun called Vulcan, comes to be around the same time as, say, when like the chemical wedding of Christian Rosicrucians, when Rosicrucianism would start. Like, a lot of this all comes out of the 17th century, is when they started to theorize. They might not have called it Vulcan yet, but it's not a surprise that they would name this hypothetical planet, after another Roman god, just like, Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars and so on. Okay. So this hypothetical planet eventually, basically due to Einstein's, and there's another odd synchronicity here, basically due to Einstein's theory of general relativity, which, when did he release that? 1915, the same year that the AMORC was started. Kind of odd, I would say. An odd synchronicity that the planetoid Vulcan would begin to be hypothesized at the same time that Rosicrucianism began. And then also it would basically be debunked, like its necessity within Newtonian physics would be debunked in the same year that the AMORC would start. It could just be coincidence. Could be. But it's odd. But moving on. I mean, Rosicrucianism ultimately doesn't, let me be clear here. Rosicrucianism doesn't really care, if there is a planet between the sun and Mercury, and it doesn't care, like, it doesn't need that for its, for its own ideology, right? Because when it's talking about Vulcan, yeah, it's just borrowing names from the solar system to kind of have, a astronomical or astrological, kind of concept, to it. Okay. Part of this evolutionary stage that you're going deeper and deeper and deeper, into the stars, as it were, deeper into the heavens. Okay. That's all they really care about. It's the symbology. It's not, they don't care whether there literally is a planetoid called Vulcan. Okay. Now, not uninteresting. Also, I mean, and another point of just remarkable oddity is that in 2018, and if I think of it, I'll link to this in the show notes, but in 2018, it was discovered that there is actually a planet in so in Star Trek, and this would get established by the aforementioned DC Fontana. I think in Spock's World might be the first time it was mentioned. Or it could have been in Diane Duane's novels, all of which everybody should be reading. I mean, yeah, they're like 40 years old, but for fuck's sake, read these things. Okay. But in the Eridani A star system, okay, which the Eridani system is where authors, Star Trek authors basically, and writers basically said, okay, this is where Vulcan is. In 2018, it was actually discovered that, the star 40 Eridani A does have a planet around it. So kind of amazing that, sure, the in our solar system, the hypothetical planet of Vulcan gets disproven in 1915, or becomes no longer a necessity in 1915. But then, in 2018, it gets discovered, well, actually, where Star Trek theorized that the planet Vulcan is, there is a planet. Now, who knows anything about that planet, whatever, that's a completely separate conversation. Is there no one's saying there's life on it, anything along those lines. But good guess. Shockingly good guess. Anyway, these are the mysteries of history. But let's keep going. So my point in mentioning the planet, or the hypothetical planet, is simply that's where they're like pulling the name from. It's not like they're just suddenly like, wait a minute, they're mentioning like all of these planetoids, or at least Rudolf Steiner is, and arguably Rosicrucianism. Again, interesting that, this name Vulcan and Rosicrucianism come around at the same time. And so their constant pull that like, this is the latest discovery. This is the highest point, you know, things like that. Like, again, interesting. Okay. But they weren't directly pulling. Rosicrucians were not directly pulling from, from the name of the god. They didn't just insert the name of the god. Yes, there's a reason that they still used the name of that god. Okay. But they pulled it from, again, this hypothetical planet. So it still fits within their astrological, I don't think astronomical would be the right word, but basically within their astrological model, or within their model in general, okay, of human evolution. So, but they still chose that name, okay, and there is meaning in choosing that name, because the idea that the hypothetical planet Vulcan is the closest to the sun pulls in some mythology of its own. Okay. I don't want to ignore that, because you have basically Icarus, right? You have the story of Icarus, who flies too close to the sun. Now, many, many years ago, 10 years ago, I had a series called the User Podcast that a lot of people still ask me to bring back. But anyway, where I would, go over a lot of different concepts. And I always say it was from the atom up. Okay. And at one point I covered, the story of Icarus, and his father Daedalus, and what that, mythical tale actually meant, because it's not this warning of like, oh, don't fly too close to the sun. That's how everybody kind of interprets it. But it's actually very much a hero's story, is that the human being can get that far. Like, you're looking at it from the wrong direction. You're looking at the fact that he fell instead of, which, yes, there's Luciferian overtones within that. And there are certainly, and we'll get into it, there are certainly Luciferian overtones with Vulcan, both the hypothetical planet, as well as the people, as well as Spock himself. Not uninteresting that in Star Trek VI, which many consider to be one of the best Star Trek movies ever made. For some people, it's right underneath Star Trek II. I definitely hold it very highly. I think it's phenomenal. Not uninteresting that Spock, the character of Spock, has the painting of the expulsion from paradise in his quarters. Adam and Eve, all that. It's a reminder. What does he say in Star Trek VI? It's a reminder that all things end. Weird. Okay. But let's keep going. So there's very Luciferian overtones, to the Icarus story, as well as, yes, like Vulcan is the closest you get within, I'll say in this sense, the astronomical or hypothetical astronomical model. Vulcan is the closest you get to touching the sun, to touching God. Okay, so there was a logic. There was a logic to choosing the name Vulcan for the highest point of human evolution. Because the only thing above that, quote unquote, above that, is the sun itself. So, approaching the sun, approaching that level of evolution of Vulcan is also the closest the human can get to achieving sonship. And you can spell that with a U or an O, whatever you want. Okay. Now, again, this is Rosicrucian ideology, which, yes, borrows heavily from Kabbalah, like I said earlier. Okay. But I want to make it clear that what I am telling you isn't necessarily what I believe, even though I don't take too much umbrage with a lot of this, but it's what the Rosicrucians believe. And probably, again, most methodically expressed by Rudolf Steiner, which, again, remember that at that time in the early 20th century, like so many of these different like New Thought movements or spiritualist movements were really all borrowing from each other. I mean, we even know that the AMORC like literally lifted from the works of Aleister Crowley, which I know for other people, that's another, basically black mark on the AMORC, like, oh, if they're borrowing from Crowley, well, Crowley's fucking evil and blah, 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 which, no, like we said earlier, incredibly misunderstood. Not saying he's a good guy, but I think a lot of his work, well, first off, he was wrong about so many things, like the man from the West never came. But regardless, there are absolute problems with Crowley's work, but then also a lot of what people, see as grand evils from his work. There's a lot of misunderstandings within that. And that's, again, I don't want to get lost on Crowley here. We're talking about Vulcans, or Vulcan. Mm-hmm. Is there a difference? Well, that's what we're exploring, right? Okay, so, where does this idea of Vulcan come from? How does this really apply to Star Trek? Even though I already like to think that I already laid down some tantalizing clues, some tantalizing hints. Like we said earlier, it's very strange that when The Cage was made, okay, in 65, right? Was that 65? Or 64. And then, and then the original series would actually air on television, 3 years later, or like in 66 and so on. Anyway, there's some time in between that, in between production. It's very interesting that the one thing, we've mentioned this earlier, the one thing that Gene Roddenberry and company, we'll put it that way, NBC wanted so many changes made, but the one thing they said, no, we will not let go of this. We will not change this. The one thing they changed, or the one thing that they kept, was Spock. Like, no, Spock stays. Okay, yeah, you don't like number one, you don't like the woman in charge, fine. Spock stays. And that was really the big, well, I guess there's debate on what was the biggest problem for them, but it should not go unnoticed that they thought it was so important, okay, that the genes thought it was so important to hold on to that character, to not get rid of his pointed ears, all of it. Like, no, we have to keep this character. And I think that provides, much of a clue. And, how much was Leonard Nimoy also saying, no, you need to keep this character? Or, is this a point where Nimoy got to step in? Because we know, this is like, we have plenty of documentary evidence for this. Okay, that Leonard Nimoy came up with so many of the symbols and ideas and concepts around what Vulcans would end up being. Because yes, Spock in The Cage is he smiles, right? He's a little bit different. And really the only difference is the smile. He still is very logical. Like, he does that kind of like a very computer-esque talking at points when he's announcing things on the bridge and everything. So, you can still tell that the character was decently established, with many ideas. So, but they had to hold on to that. And, is this where Leonard Nimoy gets to come in and say, okay, make this change, describe it like this, blah, blah, blah. Is this when he really starts to inject his, dare I say, his either, hidden or open Kabbalah at that point? Perhaps. Okay. But regardless, Spock, the fact that Spock gets held on to, despite NBC's objections, should not go unnoticed. This was considered, the Vulcans were considered that important. This character of future exploration of what they're going through has to be held on to. Okay. Now, I've made this point so many times over the years. Okay. Because people miss this. All right. And the best corollary that I can give, the best example I can give, you can remember, Weird Al Yankovic's, immortal song, White and Nerdy, right? Not the part about, bubble wrap, but the part where he says, the only question I ever thought was hard was, do I like Kirk or do I like Picard? This is such a huge debate when I was young, way before White and Nerdy ever got made. This was such a long going debate of who the better captain was, and ultimately who the better character was. But here's the deal. it's really a false choice, right? Anytime you're presented with a binary, always go with the third option. Okay, I've said that forever. And here's the deal. It's really not between Kirk and Picard. The correct answer is not, is Kirk better than Picard? The correct answer is Spock. That's the right answer. It's not about Kirk and Picard. Star Trek is not about Kirk and Picard. Star Trek is ultimately, every time, about Spock. And you can see this. Like, you can see either the conscious or unconscious recognition of the importance of Spock. Okay, in the fact that he eventually, gets brought into, of course, the Next Generation. He gets used in some form or fashion. He's even mentioned in Encounter at Farpoint, where Dr. McCoy, like 113 or I think, is he 113 or 130? Anyway, where Dr. McCoy in that, says to Data, he's like, I don't see any points on those ears, boy, but you sound like a Vulcan, right? In Encounter at Farpoint. So there's even the mention at the launch of the relaunch, we could say, of Star Trek with the Next Generation, of Spock in the very first episode. That was so key. Like, there was either the conscious or unconscious recognition, you need to mention Spock. Okay. And then, of course, later on in season 6, we'd have the classic two-parter, unification, where Leonard Nimoy actually got to return. But it goes even, deeper than that, where, and even Voyager would realize, oh, we need to have a Vulcan on board. Okay. And have this like Spock-like character. It's not uninteresting that Deep Space Nine, didn't really have much of a Vulcan character. Voyager would go nuts with it, not just with Tuvok, but also with, there's points where there was the Vulcan crewman who ended up going through Pon farr and made for very enjoyable time, depending upon if you're Tom Paris or not. Anyway, we won't get lost on that. But Deep Space Nine would rarely, like, there was that Maquis Vulcan woman, I recall, but they would rarely touch on the Vulcans. And it's not uninteresting at, I remember growing up, there were a lot of people who didn't really get into, like, especially like older, like adults, because I was very young, who didn't so much like the Next Generation or even the original series, but they loved Deep Space Nine. Like, there's so many people who love Deep Space Nine, and there's plenty of obvious reasons, either as a Star Trek fan or not. But certainly as if you were a non-Star Trek fan, there are plenty of reasons to really enjoy Deep Space Nine, partly because it was so representative of a lot of geopolitical turmoil at the time. It had a lot of stability. It wasn't about, going out and finding the forehead of the month, which is also completely unfair to Star Trek. Let me sidetrack on this for a second. We'll get right back to the Vulcans. Okay. I've mentioned this before, but I hear people on, YouTube who apparently know Star Trek better than anybody else. And no, they don't, who constantly complain about this. Now, yes. Okay. We can say that it was due to budgetary concerns, that aliens in the original series were all, 2 legs, 2 arms, more or less, which also isn't true. Right. You can think of the Horta, among many others. Okay. Where that just wasn't the case, to say nothing of the Tholians and so on. But we can say that it was due to budgetary concerns and, lack of decent practical effects, maybe, that they went, which I don't think that part of the argument holds up, because a lot of times the makeup looked like shit too. Okay. But like, that's the idea, is that, oh, they just did forehead of the month because, it saved on cost. No, that's, again, even that part of the argument, not true. Okay. Because you had like Lost in Space, where they had, or even, Twilight Zone before it, where they had no problem. Even if it looked kind of wacky, they had no problem doing things that weren't exactly bipedal. Now, you don't have to do walking, talking carrots like Lost in Space did, but, they had the opportunity to do alien species that, were not bipedal, basically, or not foreheads of the month, as it would be known. I actually think that there was a very intentional, whether it was Gene Kuhn's idea, Herb Salow, or Roddenberry himself, or maybe even maybe Nimoy. I think that they knew exactly what they were doing, and I've brought this up, which a somewhat contemporary book, of course, by famous NASA scientist Joseph Blumrich, The Spaceships of Ezekiel. In that, he makes an argument, and we cannot. Honestly, you can't overstate how steeped NASA and a lot of its top scientists were involved in the occult. You can't overstate it. Okay. And, the AMORC is part of that occult in a very real way. I could believe that there were, that maybe the production team around Star Trek, the original series, would talk to NASA scientists or scientists in general who at the time had this idea called the law of the lever. The law of the lever basically says that, that actually, like, the idea of the human, the bipedal human, 2 arms, 2 legs, all this, with the elbow and the knee, and that's the lever, okay, that is actually the best evolutionary adaptation to a multitude of environments. And so Joseph Blumrich would argue that, a lot of people speculate that aliens could look in all different kinds of, that intelligent life would look in all kinds of different shapes, but actually probably not. And in fact, you can go back to those same Enlightenment thinkers that we've been talking about this whole time, hundreds of years previous. For example, Christian Huygens, son of Constantine Huygens, but Christian Huygens, who, would discover moons of Saturn, all kinds of things. Christian Huygens also would write that, oh yeah, there's alien life out there, and it might look different than us, but probably not. And so this concept of the law of the lever had been around pretty much as long as Rosicrucianism has. And I would argue Rosicrucianism also, they basically kind of baked that in a way. Okay. I don't have like the documentary evidence of that. It may exist in Latin works that have yet to be translated. Okay. But regardless, the concepts are in spitting distance of each other. And so Star Trek actually presenting other species, Vulcans or otherwise, as looking humanoid is not like, it's not like that's just an effects decision or a budgetary decision. It's actually can very much be a scientific decision as well as an occult one. Really can. It baffles my mind that more Star Trek fans don't understand this. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about the law of the lever, but I'm just saying that like there is there is legitimacy in the idea that, okay, yeah, we have this other species out there, say like just like the Vulcans, that yeah, they would actually look very human for a good reason, quote unquote good reason. Anyway, so back to the point about Spock and about Vulcans in general being like a central part of start kicking off any other Star Trek production. Okay, we mentioned how they're not really a part of Deep Space Nine, but then Deep Space Nine is also an incredibly different animal that again, Gene Roddenberry also did not want, like we talked about earlier. Okay, but with Voyager, Vulcans would be a central part of it. Star Trek Enterprise, absolutely unavoidable. Unfucking avoidable. To Paul, all of it. And then you have, of course, after Enterprise ends, the next thing we get is, the quote unquote Kelvin timeline, Star Trek trilogy, that literally begins and ends on the character of Spock. Literally begins and ends. Like Spock is the one that rips into, this alternate timeline. Spock dies, in Star Trek Beyond, which in my opinion is the capstone of Star Trek. Like this is why Star Trek ended in 2016, because once Spock was dead, it's over. And all Discovery and all that crap, nonsense. And, there we go again with Discovery. What did they do? They literally created, they created an entire bullshit character that's supposed to be the adopted sister of Spock. Like, again, I'm not saying that they consciously knew what they were doing with Star Trek Discovery. Granted, Brian Fuller would have consciously known what he was doing. And you know, we can argue how much of what we got with at least the first 2 episodes of Discovery was actually, you know, his writing. Okay. But there's this real admission that, like, okay, no, look, Spock is what it's all about. This is where we're at. So that leads to the question. I mean, and then, you know, of course we have Strange New Worlds, with which, you know, Spock is primary character for obvious reasons. And so on. Okay. Spock is the center of it all. If you didn't realize it before, I hope that little history lesson I just gave you showed you. No, everybody knows Star Trek is about Spock. It begins and ends with Spock. Even New Trek. So, let's peel back a little bit, okay? Because then it becomes the question, well, what does Spock exactly, if Star Trek lives and dies on the character of Spock, if Spock is the central character, what is Spock all about?
Like any great alchemist, the character of Spock, particularly viewed across the 3 eras of the original series, the theatrical movies, and his appearance in The Next Generation, illustrates a far too similar kind of spiritual unfolding as the Rosicrucian Earth cosmos. Spock is a being who begins in a state of profound internal duality, defined by a constant, painful war between his analytical, logic-driven Vulcan half and his emotional, impulsive human side. His initial, suppressive logic is not his perfected state, but rather a tool used by his emerging individuality, or I, to dominate what he perceives as the chaotic, lower body impulses of his soul nature. We first find him in the original series locked in this struggle, where any breach of his logical structure is a failure. In the episode The Naked Time, a loss of control reveals a hidden, deeply conflicted self, lamenting, "I am a Vulcan, control, control," and even A Mock Time presents the absolute biological failure of logic in the face of the ancient Vulcan mating cycle. This is a mind trapped in a state of trance, trying to function in the waking world of the Rosicrucian Earth cosmos turn, unable to synthesize his full reality. A temporary, heartbreaking loss of this struggle is seen in one of Dr. Sovryn's favourite episodes, This Side of Paradise, when Spock, released from his dual burden, can state, "For the first time in my life, I was happy." A glimpse of the potential of integrated happiness if he could harmonise both aspects of his being, the true Edenic state many mythical schools seek. But the pivotal transformation, the central event of Spock's own evolution, occurs in the feature films, which represent the phase of stabilising his individual consciousness. In Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, his ultimate sacrifice on behalf of his friends is the first true act of a stabilising and maturing I. His final quote, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few," is not merely cold mathematics, it is logic infused by human love and friendship, creating an ethical calculus that enables a selfless, creative action. This action is the seed for his entire future development, that elevates him one level closer to the Rosicrucian concept of Vulcan. The ensuing search for his Katra, or spirit essence, and its subsequent restoration in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, symbolises the reunification of his fragmented being, after which he is no longer fighting a lower nature. He has mastered its expressions within a new, integrated structure, and also comes to the deeper understanding of the Atma. The good of the one can outweigh the needs of the many, a stark and correct reversal from his pre-death logic. And it is important to note that, like many of humanity's most ancient concepts of a messiah, Spock has now literally died and been resurrected. This newly mastered self is more evident in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, where he is playful and comfortable with humour, demonstrating a childlike mind that has integrated its parts into a functioning whole. And not unlike the New Testament says, "The the child is like those in heaven. Spock has used his experience of death and rebirth to fully stabilising his I, becoming a being of profound insight, such that by Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, he can declare that change is the essential process of all existence, and view logic not as an absolute, but as merely the beginning of wisdom, not the end. Finally, we encounter the perfected, integrated Spock in The Next Generation, in a state analogous to the Atma or Vulcan state of consciousness. As the Elder, the Unifier, and the Ambassador in the episodes Unification Part 1 and 2, he has completely permeated every level of his being with his refined, self-aware individuality. He is calm, completely assured, and selfless. This is the definition of the highest creative consciousness. Spock has transformed his long history of conflict and his unique duality into a sovereign, selfless creative force for the betterment of entire peoples. He has achieved the Atma/Vulcan state of consciousness, not by rejecting his lower, human nature, but by including it as the primary catalyst for his ultimate creative or co-creative action. Long gone are the days of seeking wisdom through the columnar discipline, purging all emotions. The pursuit of the Rosicrucian Vulcan Atma state is not a journey exclusive to the son of Sarek, of course. It is a universal blueprint that manifests through many in Star Trek's history, each representing a unique resistance within the Earth cosmos. If we examine the android data, we see a being who begins his evolution from the opposite pole of the spiritual spectrum, representing a synthetic old sun stage. Lacking the inherited astral or soul body of a biological entity, his entire existence is a calculated bottom-up construction of the I. In the episode The Measure of a Man, the legal argument for his sentience is effectively a scientific validation of his emerging ego or I, the point where the machine program transcends its etheric repetition and demands the right of individual choice. His later attempt to create progeny in the episode The Offspring illustrates the limitations of an incomplete Atma. While he can replicate his own sophisticated circuitry, he cannot yet anchor the creative life force, Spirit Man, into his creation, leading to his daughter Lal's terminal system failure. Data's journey is the inverse of the spiritual descent. He is the physical seed laboriously growing toward the light of the spirit, achieving a profound, selfless realization in his final sacrifice that mirrors Spock's turn toward the needs of the many. In contrast, the character of Seven of Nine represents the trauma of involution, followed by a violent, forced Rosicrucian Earth turn. As a drone, she existed in a state of collective old moon consciousness, a dreamlike hive mind where individual will was subordinated to a singular instinctive purpose. Her reclamation in the Voyager episode The Gift is the agonizing birth of the I out of the collective astral, a process that requires the spirit self to be manually carved out of her Borg programming. Her evolution is characterized by the tension between the efficiency of the machine logic she adopts as a defense and the surging, unrefined human emotions she suppressed. The early Vulcan experience, embodied by T'Pol in Star Trek Enterprise, also offers a glimpse into the Rosicrucian Earth stage at its most precarious and raw. Before the refinement achieved by Spock's era, T'Pol's struggle in the episode Impulse with the neural degradation caused by Trellium-D highlights the fragility of the I when the physical and astral bodies are in direct conflict. Her addiction and subsequent emotional volatility represent the lower nature in a state of rebellion, a necessary trial that proves logic alone is a brittle shield. Her evolution toward an integrated self requires a human vulnerability that she initially perceives as a weakness, but eventually recognises as the catalyst for a higher state of consciousness. These diverse characters, whether born of silicon, hive will, or ancient blood, all converge on the same Rosicrucian evolutionary truth. The Atma is only achieved when the I possesses the strength to permeate and transform the most resistant layers of its own existence, turning the body of the machine or the alien into a vessel for the divine creative will.
This is what Star Trek is about. And it's not just Spock, as we just elucidated. It is about apotheosis. It is about raising human consciousness as represented in characters like Spock. Not into some kind of cold logic, but into the integration of both knowledge and the animal part of the human being. If all of Rosicrucianism is ultimately about this apotheosis, this becoming like gods, this immortality, this Atma state, which sounds so much like Katra, right, from Star Trek 3. I can think of no better representation. Once you see it, once you realize, once you have that key, that is the word Vulcan, than the character of Spock and other characters like Data, like Seven of Nine, like T'Pol, or even, characters that, like, say, the character that Data was based on from Star Trek Phase 2, that being Zahn, who would have gone through a similar, maybe from a different direction like Data did, but would have gone through a similar process of this Rosicrucian concept of evolution, of human evolution, even if it's represented by some alien race. Remember, the Vulcans, here's one of the problems. A lot of people who are not Star Trek sweaties, who are not, huge Star Trek fans or Trekkies, Trekkers, whatever term you cared for back in the day, they seem to forget that Vulcans are not just are not just this emotionless species. They are a deeply spiritual race. Now, I think that totally comes from Leonard Nimoy. Okay, and his injections into the Star Trek mythos. But it is made abundantly clear from the original series onward. No, the Vulcans are not like these hardcore atheist scientists. They don't believe in God, clearly. So in that sense, they're atheist. But as in, like that somehow they have no sense of spirituality. No, the exact opposite. They have a deeper spirituality, it would seem, within Star Trek, within the confines of Star Trek, than even the humans do. That gets brushed aside way too often when it's at the heart of so much. Look, we're just talking about literally Spock is like, in a very real sense, much like a Jesus Christ. He achieves, I know some people like to use some occultists like to use the term Christ consciousness. Like, he literally dies and is born again. But you don't think about that, right? Because you're like, oh, it's Star Trek. This is all kind of scientific or whatever. No, he's like transferring like consciousness and souls and all this kind of shit. It's there. It's unavoidable. Now, I want to play a little bit with the Christ aspect of this, because if you listen to a recent episode of Sexoterica that I did with Mrs. Sovryn, we talked about how the the character of the Messiah, right? In fact, the Hebrew word Mashiach, actually through gematria, which is Kabbalistic numerology, equals the same term for serpent, for Nahash, that's used in the Genesis narrative, which Genesis, right? Can you picture the guy with the big earlobes, in Star Trek 3? Oh yeah. No, the use of Genesis, that wasn't intentional at all, was it? Anyway, this idea that the serpent, who gets attributed by Christians, again, please go, if I remember, I'll link to it in the show notes, but please go listen to that episode. I think the series is called What Really Happened in the Garden of Eden. Go listen to that to get a deeper dive on this. I don't want to, waste a bunch of time on that here. Okay. But, the Christians attribute the serpent to being Satan/Lucifer. And again, there's so many problems with that. But within popular consciousness, let's just play with that. The character of Lucifer, the light bringer, the knowledge bringer, light representing knowledge. Okay. And we're going to talk more about the god Vulcan in a minute. Okay. Because there's important things to pull from that. But this idea of Lucifer being the light bringer. Now, Lucifer is called in Torah, in the Old Testament, is called the morning star. Now, the other person called, the morning star, is actually in the book of Revelation, and that's Jesus Christ. Okay? So this idea that this Christ consciousness is like this knowledge bringer, okay, is this Luciferian character in the sense of delivering knowledge, plays in very well ultimately with the Vulcans, right? And we even get this in Star Trek First Contact, when we finally achieve, humanity finally achieves, like, okay, we finally reached to the stars. We developed warp drive on our own. Here we go. The Vulcans detect it, and they're the ones that come down and greet us. Welcome to the grander galactic civilization. Welcome to the galactic consciousness, humanity. And who's doing that? The Vulcans themselves. It's like Lucifer serpent coming down into the garden. And we get that a lot, and even, if we wanted to play with it more, okay, and I want to be careful with this. I'll say this quick. If we wanted to play with it more, kind of the duplicitous nature of the Vulcans in Star Trek Enterprise, like, really fits in well, I would argue, with popular concepts of the serpent. Again, I say popular concepts, not like the actual, more anthropological or archaeological concepts of all of these, kind of biblical characters, Hasatan, Satan, and all this other stuff that all gets into different areas. But the idea, that the Vulcans are ultimately like these Luciferians, I mean, this is, I showed you earlier, okay, that the character of Spock is, again, like he looks like a demon, and that's because, again, he is this Luciferian, like, knowledge bringer. He is this representation of, where wisdom can take you. He is Vulcan in the Rosicrucian sense. And I think that really takes us to where the importance of, using the name, or using of the Rosicrucians, using the name Vulcan, not just in the planetary sense, but in the God sense. I mean, it, like, just at first blush, it shouldn't go unnoticed that the Vulcans as a species literally have the name of a god. Like, if that's not a clue into their centrality in the concept of apotheosis, becoming like God, that's what apotheosis is. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, that's flat out. Okay. But also, this leads to, some deeper concepts in that the entire evolution, that Rosicrucian Earth cosmos evolution, that turn that occurs, that where you keep going up, from old Saturn all the way up until you get to Vulcan, to the Atma, the spirit man, until you get to that point. That entire process comes through what could be called the process of the forge. Now, when you imagine Vulcan, the god Vulcan, or I might use the Greek term just because we're using Vulcan in so many different contexts, it could be confusing. But when we're thinking of Hephaestus, who again is the Greek corollary to Vulcan, to the Roman Vulcan. When we think of Hephaestus, he's in his mountain, right? Just hammering away. Now, I mean, I know some people might want to, like, point at, wait a minute. it's a volcano god, and Yahweh is a volcano god on Sinai, you know. Big conversation to have within that, more than, I mean, this is already going, I don't know, 6-7 hours long. So I'm going to reserve that here. And if you want me to talk about it, get it in the YouTube comments, get it in the Spotify comments or Rumble, wherever. Okay. Get it in the comments if you want me to talk about that. But this entire process of going from, you know, the seedling, if we were to say that, to the Atma, to the, you know, to this apotheosis, to this godhood or sonship, S-U-N, okay, this sonship. That process is done through, in its own way, through the forge, right? You can imagine it. You can imagine Hephaestus hammering away, creating this perfect weapon. You know, something that's only fit for a god. You even think of, I mean, you know, Vulcan or Hephaestus, you know, was the son of Jupiter or Zeus. And, you know, of course, Zeus has his lightning bolts. Those were forged, you know, by Hephaestus, by Vulcan. And, you know, we go back because we can talk about these, you know, were these actual, you know, I mean, like some people, like in the ancient alien kind of crowds, you know, they want to say, well, these were like actual technologies. Now, whatever the truth is within that, many times things can be both literal, representative, or metaphorical. And it's not uninteresting that throughout many, and this includes the Hebrew, throughout many different ancient traditions, fire is often used as the representation, as the symbol of knowledge itself. And so here you have Hephaestus, Vulcan, hammering on the forge in the fire, right? And what is the human going through in this process, again, of going from seedling to Vulcan? It's this constant refining, this hammering away of the non-essential. Bang, bang, bang. I mean, you even think of like, you know, I think you can already see where I'm going with this, right? You even think of what Data went through in Measure of a Man. He's going through, you know, through a court hearing. He's literally going through a trial. He is going through the forge to be recognized as sapient. This is what we all go through. The Rosicrucians aren't wrong about this. Their use of the symbolism of the god Vulcan, of Hephaestus, is a very good one. This is it. You're on Vulcan's Forge, which is kind of punny because that's also the name of a very good Star Trek novel. but you're on Vulcan's Forge. You know, again, getting chipped away. And then there's this realization, right, within Vulcan's Forge, that it smacks very much of, you know, for my fellow fans of Conan the Barbarian, of the riddle of steel, right? What does Thulsa Doom say, you know, is the answer to the riddle of steel that Conan is trying to discover? He says, what is the sword, you know, next to the flesh that wields it? Right? Flesh is, or next to the hand that wields it, flesh is stronger. And that's what Vulcan is ultimately teaching. That's the ultimate teaching of Vulcan, is that the hammer alone is nothing until you lift it. Fire doesn't care who it warms or burns, right? Fire just, you know, it takes, it gives, it twists, it turns. But only in understanding what the fire is and how to wield it. That's where the evolution comes from. That's where the strength comes from. It's all done through the forge. It's a powerful thought. And it's not wrong. Again, this is the message of Star Trek. It's not about socialism. At least it certainly wasn't from the original series. Quite the opposite, it would seem. It's not about, you know, the necessarily the abundance. I mean, those can all be, you know, byproducts per se, but they're byproducts of the central message of Star Trek. And that is this journey of apotheosis. It is the forging of the human. We've been talking this whole time, like, where did, okay, so Gene Roddenberry is injecting all of these Rosicrucian concepts. Again, I don't think he's the only, occultist or a mystic, if he would even be willing to go that far to call himself that, involved in the whole process with Star Trek. I think there were more, including, of course, Leonard Nimoy and others. But we were talking about how Gene Roddenberry, had his most direct control of Star Trek with Star Trek: The Motion Picture, as well as seasons 1 and 2 of The Next Generation. Well, I'm very much reminded, like, it's so funny because in one sense, okay, we know the origin, like we talked about earlier. We know from season 1, the season finale of The Next Generation, we know the origin of where the no money thing came from. It came from, out of Gene's own poor life choices. Well, I don't know if they're poor life choices, but through his own life choices. And he didn't have any money for a good while. Okay, we know where that comes out of now. But what were the other great moments, shall we say, in season 1 that Picard would deliver? I think perhaps the most famous, and rightly so also, would be, actually there's two I'm going to bring up, but I'm going to bring up this one because it really drives the whole fucking point home of what we're talking about here. This apotheosis that Star Trek is all about. And we go right to the episode Hide and Q. Very early on in the production, Gene Roddenberry thought that this point that I'm about to share with you, that Picard shared with you, was that important. So Q is trying to, the whole episode, he's basically like just fondling the balls of Riker. You know what I mean? Like, really. And of humanity in general in a very real way, which he explains after their experience, during Encounter at Farpoint. And he's giving, Riker the power of a god. I mean, you can skip ahead, I'm sure, in thought and realize, the major message of that episode was humanity's not ready for that power yet. It still has to go through an evolution that leads to what? Vulcan, right? It's the whole Rosicrucian process. But Picard drives the point home because there they are, Q and Picard, in Picard's ready room. And Q's reading Shakespeare off of Picard's own shelf. All the galaxy's a stage. And of course, Picard corrects him. All the world's a stage. And he's like, well, if he was alive today, he would have said that anyway, right? That's Q's response. And then Q starts to read Hamlet. And Picard interrupts him very poignantly and says, oh, no, I know Hamlet. And what he say with irony, I say with conviction. What a piece of work is man. How noble in faculty. And he keeps going and ends off, how like a god. And Q, incensed and perhaps, and I love this because it echoes so much the moment of the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis when God is realizing that humans can do anything. God responds with fear. Saying, we've got to stop them. But what does Q do? Like the judge, once again, from Encounter at Farpoint, he throws the book, just like a judge would say in court. I throw the book at you. He throws the book at Picard and responds, again, with John Delancey, such a great fucking actor, with a hint of terror. Surely you don't see yourselves that way, do you? And Picard so confidently says, I see us becoming that one day. Becoming gods. Now, again, you want to tell me I'm reading into Star Trek too much? No, it's right there, motherfucker. And where did he get that from? Did that come from the AMORC? Did that come from his Rosicrucian leanings? I would say yes. And I think we've been proving this point the whole time. Second point I want to get to. I want to talk about reading into things for a minute, but maybe I'll save that for a second, because the second point I want to get into is another episode. Again, this is all within like the first 5 episodes of The Next Generation. Gene has to be on his high horse this whole time. We talked about how Wesley Crusher is really representative of Gene. Provably. It's not debate. We're not like reading into it. He fucking tells you as much. So don't give me that. I hate it when people read into what they want to read into things. I want to know some objectivity. That's what I want. And that's what I'm providing here. Okay, so we know Wesley is representative, right, of Gene Roddenberry himself. And what ends up being the ultimate fate of Wesley through the Traveler, right, from the episode where no one has gone before? I mean, you know, that's where the Traveler gets introduced. Of course, it's not until many seasons later that Wesley finally gets his, you know, I don't want to say comeuppance because it's not revenge, but he finally gets to the point and realizes Wesley becomes a god. Gene Roddenberry, even though he had already died, in spirit, in the show, in The Next Generation, becomes a god. How can it get more clear to you? And note how one does so. Because this is one of the beautiful things about Star Trek. And I think we've already talked about this, that Gene Roddenberry made it clear that, like, we don't treat the, you know, like, we always give reasons for why the quote unquote bad guys, and they're not really bad guys, they're just antagonists, why the antagonists are doing what they're doing. Star Trek, from the original series onward, well, at least up until 2017, did, like I said earlier, always did a great job of, you know, showing you where the antagonists, where the quote unquote bad guys were coming from. And they're to be credited for, it's to be credited for that. But Star Trek, as much as we know, like, maybe what Gene thought about apotheosis, which the groundwork for that got laid out in the episode from season 1 of The Next Generation, where no one has gone before, with the character of Wesley and the Traveler from Tau Alpha C. Star Trek always showed you alternatives. Now, maybe these alternatives didn't always work, but I think they always kind of gave it a fair shake, whether you agree with it or not. For example, we have, you know, another path for personal evolution, that being with, in the original series, that being Space Seed with Khan Noonien Singh. So, you know, you have eugenics as an option. And again, it did not, like I think we said before, Khan is not treated negatively. Not really. I mean, when you get to Star Trek 2, sure, different story, because it's, you know, they're redoing Moby Dick, but but Khan is not treated negatively in Space Seed, in that episode particularly. In fact, he's actually looked upon quite positively. Ultimately, watch it again if you don't think so. You'll see it. We have other ways, though. We also have the Borg, are another path to achieving some type of apotheosis. And as we know from the book by Yvonne Fern, The Last Conversation with Gene Roddenberry, he did not see the Borg as negative. He clearly saw a different path for himself in the case of Wesley Crusher, but he did. Star Trek shows all of these different paths. In fact, it might be the best science fiction representation of one mountain, many paths. Like, we're all trying to achieve this Atma, Vulcan, or, you know, this apotheosis, but there are many paths to that. And again, Star Trek is to be credited for that. But it explores it so much with so many different races, is how do we become the best that we can be? That's what Star Trek is about. This is what New Trek fails at, because they don't understand what I just told you. They're just stuck on the social commentary and on the quasi, the what is the space luxury communism, there's, and I'm not saying that those things are great, okay, or fine, whatever, however you feel about them, but they get stuck on that and they ignore that Star Trek is not about you being accepted for who you are, like the goddamn characters in Starfleet Academy. It is not about identity politics. It is about apotheosis. It is about becoming more than you are. When Star Trek stays at the level of social commentary, that can be like you have an A storyline and a B storyline in most great television writing, right? That can be a B storyline. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. Gay Klingons, please. Let's have them. You want to recognize, robots as robots. You want to recognize robots as living beings with data and so on. Like, let's have them. That's fine. But understand that the ultimate message of Star Trek, and if you don't play to this, you fail at making Star Trek. The ultimate message is becoming more than you are. The ultimate message is apotheosis. The ultimate message is Vulcan. The integration of the animal and the spiritual. The highest plane of existence. You don't have to agree with it, but I'm telling you, just through Rosicrucianism alone, along with all of everything we see in the episodes and all of the characters as told, it's there. That is its point. You don't have to agree with it, but that is the point. I'm not interpreting this. This isn't interpretation. It's right there. I've given you all the names. I've shown you all the characters. There's so much more I can say about this, and I will get into more of this. But this is non-negotiable. This is not an argument. I am not making an argument. I am telling you how it fucking is. You don't have to like it, but that's how it is. I mean, believe me, I hate it when people want to interpret their own bullshit into stuff. Like, it annoys the hell out of me. I mean, you can do that for yourself personally, but when you go out there, like, one of the best examples is just this horrible, horrible show, Firefly, which some idiot, I think maybe from IGN or something, some idiot 20 years ago said that, maybe it wasn't 20 years ago. Yeah, no, it was a little over 20 years ago. That is true. But some idiot was like, this is going to be bigger than Star Trek. This is going to be the new Star Trek. Yeah, like that turned out. Please. But anyway, I'm an anarchist, and I've come out of libertarian circles. And one of the things that really annoyed me was there were so many libertarians that fucking loved the show Firefly. And they would always say to me, it's like, oh, it's such a libertarian show. I love that. I'm like, man, you are grasping at straws. That show is not libertarian at all. But then, you know what? Actually, now that I say this, maybe they were right for the wrong reasons. Maybe it is a libertarian show because I know libertarians. And when I know what I know now about Joss Whedon, what everybody knows about Joss Whedon, yeah, actually, I guess it is a libertarian show. I'm so sorry. You know what? I'm going to apologize right here. I am so sorry to all those libertarians that I said, no. No, there's no way that Firefly is a libertarian show based upon Joss Whedon. But no, actually, based upon Joss Whedon, considering what he's done to women what he's done. Don't want to get ahead of myself. Yep, it's a libertarian show. And all the libertarians cancel their subscriptions to Sovryn. What are you going to do now? Anyway, another point is really when you look at the multiple times that Star Trek was going to be getting restarted, there was always a character who had the same, ultimately, sometimes inverted, but ultimately had the same crux as the character of Spock. It's also in some ways like a remix of V'Ger himself itself from Star Trek the Motion Picture, right? V'Ger wants to touch the creator. That's right out of Rosicrucianism. It's right out of it. The etma, I want the apotheosis. I want to touch the creator. I have learned everything. I've seen the entire universe, and now I need to know more. Like Spock says in Star Trek The Motion Picture so beautifully, what V'ger needs, or actually Kirk says this, what V'ger needs is a human quality. And of course McCoy says, capture God? V'ger's going to be in for one hell of a disappointment. I'm saying this to you straight. There's no teleprompter here. There's no script in front of me. Okay? This is how deep this stuff is within me. I can quote it straight. I'm not bragging. I'm just telling you how much I understand. And of course McCoy is, what else is there than the universe, Spock? And Spock says, other dimensions. He starts listing off all this stuff. This is apotheosis. This is quite literally, albeit in the motion picture goes through a technological process, as to some degree it does with data as well. This is the 7 stages of spiritual evolution. McCoy hits at it perfectly. What more is there than the universe, Spock? And who gives the answer? The person he talked to, Spock. Spock is telling you, I know. Because Spock is the central character. He is the crux of this journey of becoming whole, of apotheosis. And wait a minute. What was the final stage of human evolution called again? Oh, Vulcan. Right. What's Spock? Oh, a Vulcan. Right. Yeah. That's so strange. It's just got to be a coincidence. Yeah, we know better. But my point in saying all that is that the character of Spock, the abstract notion of Spock, was carried through every incarnation of Star Trek up until, say, Deep Space Nine, Enterprise, beautifully. The Vulcan. I love it because so many people, this is another thing where, just like how I was saying, The Next Generation was so contentious when it first came out. Enterprise was incredibly contentious when it first came out. Why? Because of the way that it depicted the Vulcans at first. People didn't like that. They're like, no. Wait a minute. The Vulcans they're the good guys. We like the Vulcans. Hell, we want to be the Vulcans, whatever. You know what I mean? Like people had such a visceral reaction. And I know, because I was there, people had such a visceral reaction, and we had the internet at the time even, to talk about it. People had such a visceral reaction to the negative portrayal, dare I say the duplicitous portrayal of the Vulcan people in Enterprise, that's one of the first things that really turned people off to that show. Because and it's unfortunate because it's a great show. And also I think that the conflict that Spock had as an individual from the original series onward, right? And of course we see his ultimate evolution in Star Trek VI, where he so beautifully, wonderfully says, after living 2 lives, and in fact, even literally in Leonard Nimoy directed Star Trek 3, literally, goes through not just reincarnation. I mean, we got to talk about that. But he goes through resurrection, dies and comes back. Rosicrucianism? Right? Remember, they carry the Rosicrucians, the cross. That's what Rosicrucian means, rosy cross. They carry the cross. They believe in Jesus. Anyway, the central, or what did I say in Star Trek 6? We're logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. Right? That is code for science is the beginning of wisdom, but not the end. You need mysticism. Okay? And the beautiful thing that Enterprise which is why I love the show that it portrayed, is it showed the Vulcan as an entire people, as a culture. It showed them going through the very thing that Spock went through for, from the first episode of Star Trek all the way, to Star Trek 6 and beyond. Like that conflict of harmonizing, because, what's also like we can say that logic is this metaphor for science. Human, like Vulcan, the Vulcan side and the human side are just metaphors for science and mysticism that have to come together. There's so much more I want to say. I think you're getting my point. And again, just like rewatch the shows and you're going to see this, including Enterprise. Star Trek is about apotheosis. Star Trek is about human potential, but not human potential in like the cultural, corporate woke sense or like socialist sense, post-scarcity sense. It is about the individual coming to truly understand who and what they are, what they're capable of. And it gets spoken in many different ways throughout the entirety of Star Trek. It can't help itself. It's just there. Learn all that is learnable. Again, logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. And again, and everybody knows these things, like, live long and prosper, right? Which is literally talking, like that phrase alone is apotheosis. It's talking about, it's not just saying, like, it's saying immortality. Like, it's so beautiful. So first off, you have this, symbol, or this hand symbol that is, the traditional blessing of the Kohen Gadol, right? Of the high priest, okay, within Judaism. So you have that, which, Nimoy, everybody recognizes that Nimoy came up with that. But then even the phrase live long and prosper is code for what for the concept, the Rosicrucian concept of Vulcan. Like, it's perfect. It's too perfect. Like, there's no way it's not laid out. There's no way it's not like thought out. Even infinite diversity, like here's another Vulcan, like what's the Vulcan concept, right? IDIC, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. Now we can say that, okay, like the Vulcan symbol, which by the way, the Vulcan symbol is a slightly turned, maybe I'll put it on the screen here. It's a slightly turned pyramid with a diamond at the top. So it's a pyramid with one eye and then the sun around it. That's literally what that symbol is. And you're telling me Star Trek isn't spiritual. Now, some of these ideas would, become necessities because they wanted to have a marketing machine. They wanted to sell pins or little gold enterprises and everything, through, what was the company? Lincoln Enterprises, I think was the name of it, where they sold merchandise for Star Trek for decades, and it ended up getting run by Gene Roddenberry's son and everything. Hell, it might even exist in some form today, but I don't think so. Regardless, like all of this stuff is in there, all of it. And the more you even read about Rosicrucianism and that you read about, mysticism in general, like it's all there. And the Vulcans are shown again as this is the point that you get to, but it's not the emotionless Vulcans. It's the Spock type Vulcan where he recognizes the value that logic is not the beginning. Okay. It's so beautiful then in Star Trek, the motion picture, that he denies the Kolinar discipline, like the complete purging of emotions. Like he's going for it and he's able to do it because Spock is so goddamn good, right? Because Spock is representative. He is the Atma. He is the, or as we'd say in Kabbalah, he is the Adam Kedmon. He can do it. But then he hears the other in the distance. He hears V'ger and he puts up his hand and he says, stop. Even that moment looks like Freemasonic ritual when you watch it in Star Trek, the motion picture. Now, a couple other quick points just to show that Spock is the focus of Star Trek and always has been. Even if people didn't realize it, he's always been the focus. And we'll talk about, like, wait, what does it mean to not realize this? Okay. Like, how does this happen within art? You know, maybe the famous George Lucas, it's poetry, it rhymes. Okay. Why does it rhyme? But I don't find it uninteresting that it's one of the most famous essays on Star Trek ever. And it's actually by Isaac Asimov's daughter. And she's talking about how wildly sexy Spock is. Not Kirk. Not that, and hey, look, man, talking to me. Am I saying William Shatner isn't sexy? The fuck I'm saying that. Maybe this, at least in the top 3 sexiest men to ever exist. Woo. Woo. I don't even want to call him God. I mean, God can be wrong, you know. But William Shatner? Woo. Don't confuse me. But I think that there's a very real reason that Isaac Asimov's daughter, which, can you imagine her upbringing, would say that, wait a minute, Spock is the one that gets me, you know, proverbially or essentially hot and bothered. Even Ellen, I think, would you know, Mrs. Sovryn would say the same. Like, oh no, it's Spock. Add into that, let's go back to 1965. Before Star Trek is even on the air. And the first pilot episode, again, unheard of, that a second pilot, like, you know, this is such a part of the Star Trek legend that it's unheard of that any TV show would actually get an order for a second pilot, even though the studio hated the first one and put so much money on it. And you can watch The Cage, the first pilot that never officially aired on television until decades and decades later, you know, and it, even then is more of a curio. I can even think of many like hardcore Star Trek fans that have never seen it. I mean, they know of the scenes that were used in, again, the aforementioned The Menagerie, but they don't, you know, they've never seen it. I think it's absolutely worth watching. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful production in many ways. I mean, it's very different in some ways, but at the same time, there's one thing that is not so different. In fact, I mean, I could read into it a lot more if you really wanted me to. But we have, like, you know, other than Captain Pike, who's very famous now, and I suppose also Majel Barrett's character at the time, who was only called Number One until she ended up getting another name later. You know, Spock would be like the character you would really recognize, even though there are other actors that would end up being a part of the original series that were also involved. But Spock was there. And this was, you know, when The Cage was made, and again, NBC was like, no, we don't want this. This is too like, why a woman second in command, referring to Majel Barrett's character? Like, what the fuck? You're not going to do that. What's this guy, Leonard Nimoy, walking around with these pointy ears looking like Satan? You're not going to do that, Gene. Like, all the effects are impressive. This is impressive. You got Jeffrey Hunter, who played Jesus, literally. No symbolism there. He only played Jesus in for what for many decades was the most famous Jesus movie, you know, ever made, King of Kings. That wasn't a choice. But I knew it. We were going to get Jesus versus the devil in a future episode. Jeffrey Hunter was going to take on Leonard Nimoy. Anyway, but so they're like, okay, look, Gene, you can't have Number One. Like the woman's got to go. Okay, you can have a woman on the bridge, but she can't be second in command. We're not going to sit for that. But Gene and whoever else involved, perhaps Herb Sallow, says we have to keep the Vulcan. We have to keep Spock. And somehow they let that stand, even though I think, and maybe it was just because like the woman was far more controversial. And it's a shame we never got that, because I think, again, this exploration of apotheosis, this joining of of the mystical and the scientific, of the emotions and the logic. Again, which is all Rosicrucianism, right? It's all that journey of that trek. If there's a real trek, it's not Star Trek. It's the trek of apotheosis, the journey of the soul. That's what's on display here. It would have clearly been laid out with number one. Like, and at some point, you know, she would, because she plays this very cold, almost Vulcan character. And in fact, some of the other times that she had been written in novels, including up to modern day, there was the first novel that was supposed to be canon, but then was said, no, that wasn't canon because Spock was in it and blah, 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 with Michael Burnham. This is actually the first appearance of Michael Burnham before Discovery even went on the air. That very first novel, her character, number one, is in that. And she's not even, like, she's another race, or she was like raised by another race, not humans, who are somewhat Vulcan-like. Okay. And it's actually a great novel. I mean, fuck the character, like, forget the character of Michael Burnham. You know, that could have been interesting. It didn't happen. And certainly screw all of Kurtzman Trek, but like just throw it out. But there was a great moment in that novel. That novel was very good. There's a great moment in that novel where, like, number one and, you know, Spock, like, you know, have these, conversations, you know, where number one is like relating to, like, I know what it's like, you know, to be raised by, and she's even having, like, with Michael Burnham or whatever, you know, that she knows what it's like to not be connected to her human side. Right. I mean, you know, just as another quick side note, I mean, basically, like, Discovery literally hung its hat effectively on the character of Spock, because what did they do? They created a character, that being Michael Burnham, who is this adopted sister of Spock. Spock is always the center of the story. Okay. Anyway, back to my point. I would have loved to have seen, you know, what Star Trek would have been with the cage, because I think the abstract point would have been the same. It's that it's this journey of apotheosis, but it would have been even more precious, dare I say, more beautiful, with it being where this hard-nosed woman, you know, at some point in the future, like, evolves and allows her emotions and her sensuality and all these other things to fully express themselves. And that would have been a very powerful moment. Would have been, you know, a moment of the Shekinah, as we would say in Kabbalah. It's a shame we didn't get that. And I haven't watched Strange New Worlds enough to know, but as far as I know, it certainly hasn't happened there. And that's unfortunate too, because you had every chance for it to do so. But this gets to my point. Why does Star Trek suck today? Because they don't consciously understand what Star Trek was actually about. Unconsciously, they clearly picked up on some things, right? Like we talked about with Michael Burnham and Spock. But consciously, they don't understand it. And so they can't write it. Otherwise, you could have had, I mean, because Rebecca Romijn is a tremendous actress. And I mean, you could have had some amazing moments with her, you know, going through her own, shall we say, soul journey, her own apotheosis. But we'll never get that. So I feel like I kind of went all over the place here, but I hope I'm painting a picture. And I think when you watch Star Trek in its totality, or just think about it, if you've been watching Star Trek forever, this stuff's all in your head, you know, like you remember all of it, and just think about it. And you're going to start, you'll see this like, oh man, like this isn't a scientific journey. This is a spiritual journey. And, you know, to speak to that, and again, there's a point I want to talk about. Like, wait, how did this all run through for so many years, so many decades? How is this through line able to exist? You know, a lot of people, again, I was there. Okay. I mean, I think some of us watch Star Trek Voyager now. Now, I've always loved Star Trek Voyager for very different reasons than why Star Trek is great, though. Okay. I have always said Star Trek Voyager was Star Trek for Star Trek's sake. It was basically like, it was lore porn. Okay. And I don't mean Data's brother, though that's an interesting thing to consider as well. Okay. Like you literally have Cain and Abel. Anyway, uh, this is lore porn. Where it's like it's just entrenching itself in the incredible universe, fictional universe that Star Trek created and its adventures within that and considering life within those rules. Okay. And one of the great values really of Star Trek Voyager is, was there an episode, the episode I believe is called Prime Factors, where there's this planet where basically like the Voyager crew in the Delta Quadrant has to deal with, whoa, we're encountering a civilization more advanced than us. We need their technology, but they're telling us that we're not advanced enough and we can't share our technology because the one time we did that, it was disastrous because the people weren't ready to handle their technology, or we couldn't live with that our advanced technology could be used to harm someone else. Now, that idea actually comes from a classic Star Trek novel from the 80s called Spock's World. And that whole idea that there was another planet in the Vulcan star system, the star system that the planet Vulcan is in, and they shared their technology, and the civilization ended up like wiping itself out. So it's not like like this really great episode of Voyager actually comes from a very old Star Trek idea, from a novel, in fact, that also had to do with Spock. But it's this excellent like play and consideration on the Prime Directive, and like we said, the Prime Directive, I think for sure is a cornerstone of the philosophy of Star Trek, of what part of what Star Trek is trying to say. Okay, now, as we made clear, previously here, Gene Roddenberry did not come up with the Prime Directive. Gene L. Kuhn came up with the Prime Directive. We know this. This is not debate. Okay? But that episode of Voyager does a great job of really parlaying what, like the nature of the Prime Directive. So when, Gene L. Kuhn came up with the Prime Directive, I don't think it's unfair to say that its primary purpose was to create a moral conflict within an episode. Okay. Like I said earlier, where this incredibly technologically advanced organization, that being Starfleet, encounters, more quote unquote primitive peoples. And, like, do we interfere with the problem of these primitive peoples? Or do we not? You think of an episode like A Private Little War, right? Where, do we arm, the Klingons are arming one side of a conflict on this planet, of these primitives, primitive people on these planets, or on this planet. Do we arm the other side? And it's actually an episode that ends with no answer. Like basically Kirk does arm the other side. It's actually an incredibly dark episode, but so it's a great way to create like ideological conflict within a show. Okay. It really is. But it's something more, because it's also the question that the adept, or that, shall we say, the magus to the adept constantly asks. Is the student, or let's use the terms teacher and student if we don't want to be so mystical about it, but it is mystical. The teacher asks themselves, is the student ready for the next evolution? Is the student ready for the next level? Is the student ready for this next bit of knowledge? And Star Trek was playing, the Prime Directive was just as much something within the show as it was something, that was being, played upon the viewer. Are you ready for the next idea? Are you ready for the next idea? Like it's almost Star Trek at a meta level, in the sense that, like, Star Trek is here laying out all of these Rosicrucian ideas, okay? And it's testing the student, the viewer. It's testing the viewer. Are you ready for the next level? Are you ready for the next level? And the Prime Directive is like the central part of that. Like, we cannot interfere if you don't show that you're ready for the next level. Now, unfortunately, and this would actually get directly stated by Q in both Encounter at Farpoint which again was directly had controlled by Gene Roddenberry. And then also later on in All Good Things, humanity is on trial. Are you ready for the next? Are you ready for the next level? Are you going to evolve to the next point? Now, I got lost on this because I know we're all over the place, but this is a very complex conversation to have. Okay. But I love Voyager. Let's get back to Voyager quickly, because this can lead us into kind of the next point I want to get to here. Like I said earlier, Voyager was Star Trek for Star Trek's sake. Okay. It became very much just about, basically Star Trek's own internal fictional mythology. All right. And it's fun for that. It's really, really very fun. Even though there's great episodes, like I mentioned, was a Prime Factors, like these. I mean, there's other episodes that get really wild. And obviously all the stuff with the Borg is great. And of course we end up with another character that is all about this internal journey, right? And that being 7 of 9, which I get so annoyed when people talk about how 7 of 9, I mean, yes, okay, did they hire Jerry Ryan for a reason? Sure. But that character was so much more. And I would also very much argue, and if you've listened to Sexoterica, I mean, fuck, it's in the name. If you've listened to me on Sexoterica, that sex and sexuality, are a major part of mystery schools. Okay. Depending upon, I mean, it can look like different things in different ones. Okay. And all have theirs to do, but her sexuality, her sex appeal is, in my opinion, I mean, we can say, sure, they didn't have to go as far as they did with Jerry Ryan if you want. And the suits were ridiculous. And I'm not going to argue, about that. Like you're not wrong. Okay. But the idea of putting sexuality on display, like I would actually argue that. So what I was going to get at with Voyager is that Voyager ended up, a lot of people complained about Voyager at the time. Again, I was there. Okay. A lot of people complained about Voyager at the time. They feel like, oh, like it's all just like technobabble. Like it's not really expressing Star Trek, and they're not wrong, because other than scant episodes, Voyager became more about Star Trek and less about what Star Trek is about. It stopped being about apotheosis until really the character of 7 of 9 ended up, on the show. And her arc, her abstract character, albeit female, is very much Spock. It's still Spock, right? It's the machine versus the man or the woman. In fact, in some ways, I was talking earlier about number 1 in The Cage and, Major Barrett's character. 7 of 9 kind of gave us that opportunity to see the woman, come into her own. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, Voyager never really went all the way, in the sense that we got to explore, 7 of 9 becoming this incredibly sexually charged character, which, from a Kabbalistic perspective, and depending upon the school we're talking about, I would also argue somewhat within a Rosicrucian perspective, would be a major part of that journey of apotheosis. Okay. But you see, so, for those that think oh, wow, yeah, Voyager is not in fact, I know very few people who would say that Voyager is their favorite Star Trek. And I think a big part of that comes down to is that I wouldn't say it lost its way. It lost its way from what Star Trek was really meant to be about. But it still fits perfectly well within Star Trek. And I know a lot of people go back and watch it now and they enjoy it a lot more. And of course, I think the reason for that is just because what's made today is so much garbage that you go back and watch anything from the 90s, and you're like, what? This is Da Vinci. No pun intended with Da Vinci actually being in Voyager. But I would actually get some vindication on this. Personal experience. In fact, I kept a screenshot of this. Now, look, I am not one of those people, and believe me, I am not. I am not one of those people who, lives their life, shall we say, on social media. Okay. I mean, social media is not even social media anymore, right? they're basically like Instagram's a fucking TV network. It's not, you're not connecting with your friends. Admit it. Same with X, same with anything. Like that's not, you're not going there to get updates on your friends' lives. And even if you do, that is like 0.01% of what you're doing on there. You know it. And TikTok sure as fuck isn't social media, please. These things are illusions of friendship, right? Because like you feel like you're seeing into their world. I mean, this is just as true for movies, you know, like with actors. Like, why did we care when actors were dying? Because they coexisted with us in a way that had emotional attachment. And so it's this illusion of friendship. And so when they died, it mattered because they were a part of our lives for so long. Okay. And I'm not saying that an illusion of friendship is inherently bad. It can actually be healthy. Okay. But understand what it is and understand that social media isn't social media anymore. Okay. Not to get lost. So 7 of 9, like I said, 7 of 9 never got to be that, very sexually charged. And I mean that in a very positive, mystical sense, coming into her totality as a human, because we are social and sexual beings. I know there are asexual people. Okay. I want to be very gentle with that. But again, like from a more Richard Dawkins scientific sense, I don't think it's unfair to say, that we're sexual beings. Okay. So we did not see her come into that apotheosis, which again is the agenda of Star Trek. Okay. Even Data had sex. That should have been a clue in. The naked now. Like really, you had to remake one episode, Gene, and you chose the naked time to remake, and you even had the android be fully functional, you son of a... Anyway, we didn't get that moment with 7 of 9. However, many years ago, when for me, Instagram actually more mattered, and I think it was, 10th or 15th anniversary, one of those, for Star Trek Voyager. And I made a post on, about it on Instagram. And this is one of the proudest moments for me. Again, like I said, I don't normally say this, and I don't at all live on social media. Okay. But I've had 2 or 3 moments where I was like, man, I'm glad I was on social media. This is one of them. The other one was years ago on Twitter. I had said to Mark Hamill, or I had tweeted at Mark Hamill, that you'll always be the heart of the tiger to me. And my wing commander, sweaties know what I'm talking about. And he hearted that, and just that small connection that he saw me call him the heart of the tiger. Worth it. Totally, totally fucking worth it. Right. Just like actually on Instagram a couple of years ago, Sebastian Spence, I got to, like he said, happy holidays to everybody. And I got to say happy holidays 117. Now you got to be real sweaty to know what the fuck I'm talking about there. Greatest shit ever though. Really. Okay. And I got a heart on it and I'm like, nice. That's rare today because back in the day, you actually, part of what made social media exciting was that you could like, especially like say in Twitter's early days, people like celebrities would interact with you. So I understand for a lot of people why it was so exciting. Right. Okay. Anyway. Okay. So all of that aside, like it's not that way anymore. Now they just, it's a one-way street. Like I said, it's a TV network. It's not social media. Okay. But at this time, celebrities would still sometimes interact with things, and I had a pretty good following on Instagram at the time, like 5,000 followers, which again, we're talking like 2016, 2017, something like that. So, or maybe 2015 even. Social media was still that way. And so I made this post. Sorry, I know I'm telling this story for so long, but it's important to this. I made this post about Voyager saying, and I was serious. I mean, I'm a good writer, or I like to think I'm a good writer. And so I made it kind of humorous, but I was very serious. I was like, basically, happy anniversary to Star Trek Voyager, to the cast and crew, to what could have been the greatest porn of all time. Stuck in the Delta Quadrant. And the first thing you know, it's going to take you so many decades, who knows how long, to get back home. you got to start having babies. Like sex has got to start happening. And I literally use that term. I use that word. I said what could have been the greatest porn of all time. I didn't tag anybody in this. I did hashtag Star Trek Voyager, but I didn't tag anybody. But you know who I got a like from? Jerry Ryan. I share this story with you, not to boast, because who the fuck cares? It's social media. I share the story with you because I feel like that was some degree of vindication of the point that I was just making. That the actress who even played Seven of Nine, like, recognized the sexuality aspect of apotheosis, basically, is what I'm getting at. And so to me, it's tacit recognition from Seven of Nine herself that Star Trek Voyager should have been a porn. That there should have been some sex in that show. And I mean, actually, there are points where there was, right? Like, actually, one of my favorite moments where when the one Vulcan character is going through Ponfar, and it kind of it gloms on, shall we say, to B'Elanna Torres. I mean, again, Voyager still got it right a lot of times. It's a great show. It really is a great show. But yes, it did lose its kind of ultimate way from, it was Star Trek for Star Trek's sake. It was not Star Trek for apotheosis' sake, is what I'm getting at there. D Space Nine is certainly a big conversation to have that I'm not going to get into here and now. If you want me to talk about it at some point in the future, please get that shit in the comments. Okay. And I can do a breakdown of that. But in many ways, Deep Space Nine is a very different animal. Like I've said multiple times during this recording, Gene Roddenberry did not want Star Trek Deep Space Nine to be a thing. And, what is the reasoning behind that? What did Gene, what was going on for Gene at the moment? Was he realizing that, this isn't exactly going to play into the agenda? Maybe. Again, conversation to have at another time. There's so much more. I mean, I've been going for so many hours here. There's so much more that I could talk about, as far as the evidence of the absolute Rosicrucian nature, the mystical nature of Star Trek, and I mean, the key, this is how mysticism works. Okay. This is how mystery schools work, is often the mystery school is not that secretive. Like, yeah, there's rituals that they'll do in secret or something like that. But often they're right out in the open. Everybody knows that they're there. In fact, their books, their quote unquote holy texts, may be out in the open. And it's actually a defensive strategy for a lot of mystery schools. It's like, no. Yeah, our book's right here. You can read it. Go ahead. It's fine. But what you need to understand those texts, what you need to understand what's being espoused by the mystery school, you need a key. And often that key is one word. Sometimes it's even one letter. This is very true. You can, okay. There, like, for example, in Kabbalah, there is, the broad knowledge that there is a letter missing from the Hebrew alphabet. And once we have that letter, the Torah will be completely unlocked. Okay. Now, this is just as true. Again, this is true for most mystery schools. So Star Trek, if we were to say Star Trek, the mystery school, what is the key that unlocks everything? The key is the word Vulcan. Once you understand what Vulcan means. And again, what is Vulcan? Vulcan, in the mystical tradition, okay, particularly with Rosicrucianism, but in the mystical tradition, is the highest state of human evolution. Spiritual evolution, not just science. You need to have that key. But once you have it, like I said, you're never going to watch Star Trek the same. You're going to go through all that. I mean, and look at the features even of the Vulcans themselves, right? They're super strong. Like they have like telepathic abilities. They can transfer, they have an immortal soul. They can transfer their souls. Like there's so many things that are all these powers that when you read not just Rosicrucian, but lots of mystical texts throughout history. These are like the advanced powers of the gods, or the advanced powers of that the initiate will eventually have. And they're all within Spock. So now you have the key. Now you can see everything that Star Trek is really saying. Now, I mentioned earlier that with the AMORC, which Gene Roddenberry was apparently a member of and got his Rosicrucian knowledge from. And who invited him to that? Was it somebody else on the set of Star Trek that helped him lay out all this stuff? And again, Leonard Nimoy, Kabbalist, of course, had a complete understanding. Like, even if his involvement in making... Actually, I'm going to take a moment here because my brother Robin Freebeard made such a great observation. He said that Gene Roddenberry was the Steve Jobs to Leonard Nimoy's Woz, as in Steve Wozniak from Apple, right? Because like Woz is the guy that made all the computers. Woz is the guy that built the damn company. Steve just took the credit, right? No, I mean, you could inject Gene L. Kuhn in as Woz if you wanted to, but we don't have to get that technical on the matter. I just think it's a brilliant observation. Okay. And also Steve Jobs, I don't want to take too much away from Gene Roddenberry. I also don't want to take away too much from Steve Jobs. Because I think that the tech world is worse off without him. But that's a separate conversation to get into. Okay. So Nimoy's injection of all of these concepts, that we've hinted at or directly talked about, during this. I mean, there's a lot more that could be said on that, but something, again, we're talking about the AMRC. So I want to get into that a little bit more because, there's not necessarily a lot of controversy of like, oh, the AMRC is like doing this dastardly thing, here and there and whatever. What is probably the most famous controversy with the AMRC is, so the head of the AMRC is called the Imperator. I know, right? Anyway, gives you all those Palpatine vibes. No, they're not evil. No, they're not. Well, anyway, so the third Imperator of the AMORC was Gary L. Stewart. Now, in the early 90s, he would actually be acquitted of all this, but in the early 90s, there was like the board of directors. Yes, the AMORC has a board of directors, accused Stewart of embezzling, I don't know, something like $3-4 million. And basically pushed him out of being Imperator. Now, years later, again, he would be acquitted of all this, as I understand it. Okay. But Gary Stewart would go on to say that, no, this is a coup. I'm being pushed out because I'm trying to defend the traditional ways of the AMORC. And there are, you can actually, and I'm sure online, you can read about this. I mean, on Reddit, it might just be bots and AI, but, but you can read about this, that, there are a lot of, Rosicrucians, basically members of the AMORC, who feel that, oh, this has all been watered down. Like our message has been watered down. And I mean, this happens in every religion, right? Like, I mean, a lot of people say the Catholics, like you think of, in Catholicism, like you have the Second Vatican Council, right? Where, a lot of priests, even, and varying, cardinals, bishops, whatever, who felt, wait, you guys are getting rid of the Latin Mass. You're getting rid of all these traditional standpoints from the Council of Trent, that the Catholic Church has held for thousands of years, blah, 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 blah. And you end up with what's called the Sedevacantist movement. Okay. And the Sedevacantists are like, no, the Second Vatican Council never happened. We are still going to do the Tridentine Mass. Right. So this happens like in every religion. It's like, oh no, you're not Catholic enough. You're not this enough. You're not that enough. And this happened within the AMORC in the 90s. But it was something that was going on, according to Gary Stewart, it was something that was going on for at least 10 to 15 years previous, where there was just this watering down of, of their precepts. And, I guess trying to go for mass appeal, right? Got to get more money. You always got to wonder when, granted, here's Gene, like I don't have any money, man. All right, we need to, in Star Trek, we need to say, yeah, money's got to go, but then it all gets very confusing. Okay. My point being is if there is this belief that Rosicrucians were still kind of running the show, okay? And this might be, if we're to use Christian terms, this might be one of Gene's greatest, we could say greatest sins, but it depends on what side of things that you're on, okay? But it seems pretty clear, we were talking earlier in the novel of Star Trek The Motion Picture, how Gene was saying that humanity is going to get to this hive mind. Now, this idea of humanity getting to a hive mind, that is also, depending upon your tradition within Rosicrucianism, like I said, there's a lot of different denominations. We were just talking about that with Gary Stewart. It's like, oh no, this is the real, actually Gary Stewart would go on to form another Rosicrucian group that claimed to have the truth as compared to, what the AMORC had for so long. There's points where you can pull from Rosicrucianism where there is this idea that when you're actually achieving Vulcan, okay, that highest stage, and you're like really connecting with the Atma, right? That you actually sacrifice, the I, okay? You sacrifice the ego. Now, the irony is that the ability for these spiritual messages, shall we say, to transmit throughout decades of Star Trek actually disproves that point, in my opinion, and I want to be clear on that. Okay. It's not just my opinion, but that's what I'm espousing, but let's keep going. Okay. So Gene's idea that as we evolve, as we go up towards Vulcan, that we actually become like a group hive mind is, that falls somewhat in line. Okay. With what he may have been taught, with what certain, Rosicrucian groups or certain other, like the Nine or whoever, whatever form of spirituality or mysticism or, alien contact, if you believe it, what was like espousing this. Okay. So my point is it fits. Okay. It can fit. This is nowhere in the original series. Okay. But regardless, it would be a part of Star Trek The Motion Picture, the novel, and would then make its, dare I say, at least for Gene, its ultimate expression with the Borg, who, as we mentioned in Yvonne Fern's book, as well as other sources, that Gene said that, no, the Borg aren't the bad guys. Like that the Borg have a thing or two to teach us. That the Borg are an expression of the hive mind that Gene thought we were all going to evolve into. And I don't think it's unfair to say that that was Gene's idea. And of course, Gene would go on later. This would be actually, it would never be considered exactly canon. It would be in William Shatner's book, phenomenal book, The Return, which everybody should read, as well as all of William Shatner's Star Trek. Actually, all of William Shatner's novels, tech novels, Man of War novels, the Quest for Tomorrow books, all of them. Read everything by William Shatner. Okay? Remember, God can be wrong, but William Shatner? But in The Return, it makes it clear that V'ger from Star Trek The Motion Picture was actually repaired by the Borg. Now, in the Star Trek chronology, and I know at least in the first edition of that, in other editions, it may or may not be there, but I'm like super familiar with the first edition that Michael and Denise Okuda wrote. But they even make a note in the Star Trek chronology, and I think it was in the encyclopedia as well, which they worked on, where they would say that Gene Roddenberry said that the machine planet you see in Star Trek The Motion Picture is the home planet of the Borg. We could argue whether or not Voyager debunks that or whatever, but Gene was playing with that idea. So Gene is positive on the Borg and says that, yeah, this is where V'ger came from, or like was repaired, right? And able to complete its mission. So at some point, and this isn't even new for Rosicrucianism, at some point, or mystical schools in general, at some point, the idea that the way to achieve apotheosis, the way to achieve the Atma, that immortality, is through humanity joining with the machine. The perfectibility, as they say. This would, I mean, and we could look at, we can go way, I mean, centuries back, looking at the work of Albertus Magnus, who was, you know, well, it's claimed he was a Catholic priest. I mean, yeah, like he's a doctor of the church, you know, so sure. But he's the person that basically came up with the concept of the android, right? Like he came up with the automata, like this was him. Okay. And of course, Rosicrucians are very, very bullish and positive about Albertus Magnus. So at some point, there's this injection of, okay, we are going to achieve these goals. Again, these goals of apotheosis through joining with the machine. Now, that's not a part of Star Trek, the original series. And perhaps the greatest expression of that would be the episode Space Seed, which in fact, as well as the character of Spock, of course. But, you know, in Space Seed, keep in mind, like, this should both like intrigue you and bother you at the same time, that the crew of the Enterprise in Space Seed do not condemn Khan. I mean, yes, they condemn him to that planet, but they actually give him an entire planet. And not uninterestingly, they also claim somebody who the Rosicrucians also claim are part of their school, that being John Milton, right? You know, better to reign in hell than rule in heaven. Like that's, Khan says that at the end of Space Seed. Have you ever read Milton, Captain? And even Spock says it would be amazing to see what seed, I mean, that's where the term Space Seed, or where the title Space Seed comes from. You know, what seed, you know, we've planted on SETI Alpha 5. Of course, in Star Trek 2, we find out this is SETI Alpha 5. You know, we find out what happened there. Anyway, so, but clearly, like the idea of maybe, you know, eugenics, overall, the idea that, you know, humanity would through biological means, not necessarily machine means, like achieve this higher level. I mean, and it's funny that like basically, you know, it seems that Khan, like a genetically engineered human effectively achieves the levels of a Vulcan. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on this. But the apotheosis of the human was not something done by joining with machines in the original series. Star Trek, the motion picture, different story. I mean, you literally have like the fusing of the masculine and the feminine, and then the machine in Star Trek, the motion picture. And this is not new for me to say. I told people, 15 years ago on Sovryn Tech, that like, no, you don't understand. Star Trek, the motion picture is like one of the most occult films ever made. And you have part of the keys now to understand that. Okay. But that's right there. And the Borg are also an expression of this. Like, okay, how can we actually achieve this immortality and this hive mind? It is through, you know, the joining of the biological and the machine. Now, there's an argument to be made that the entire reason that like this idea of joining with the machine happens is not because of the potentiality of Gene Roddenberry's Rosicrucian beliefs, that he believed that, you know, yeah, okay, we achieve apotheosis through joining with the machine. He may have just done that to get his ideas across, but make them palpable for Isaac Asimov and his other science fiction friends. To be like, yeah, no, all these ideas, oh yeah, they're ancient ideas. Yep, we do it scientifically. No spirituality required. Like, that's one interpretation of what's going on there. Or what's happening is that within Rosicrucianism, particularly the AMORC, there is this opening of, again, they're based in California, Silicon Valley. Okay, there is this opening to, we can achieve these Rosicrucian goals through joining with the machine. Now, conspiracy theorists, again, I don't say that derogatorily, will often bring up that this is like the ultimate goal, of Silicon Valley and of governments and, the elites, right? I really should just call them the leeches, but the leech class is they want their robot bodies, and they want to live forever. There's a huge conversation to have within that, and I'm certainly open to having it. Get your questions in the comments or email me at questions@orx.email. If you want me to go into that, we'll probably get into that. I guaranteed we'll get into that in the future on Sexoterica. But if you want me to get into it early and actually even come from the, start with Star Trek as a lens, as a framework, perhaps, I could certainly do that as well. Okay. But the idea of, even Data is like an expression of this, that like, aha, yes, we achieve this through the machine, and we do it through perhaps awakening the machine, which is, Data's lot in life. And, did that come out of the splintering in the AMORC? That's where we start to speculate, and I would have to dive deeper personally. I'm not that invested in the AMORC. Like, it might sound like I know a lot about it. Yeah, I know some things, but like, I'm not in the forums, baby. Like, and I do have a very large collection of issues of the Rosicrucian Digest, and I do have them in Notebook LM for that matter. Okay. But I, by no means have I like read them in depth. There's certainly great ideas within that. I'm definitely very familiar with the writings of Rudolf Steiner. Like that, I will, I'll hang my hat on that for sure. But I wouldn't by no means claim that I'm super familiar with the particulars of, especially the civil war that was occurring supposedly within the AMORC in the 90s. And at the time, fuck, I was like 10 years old, at the time. So anyway, where this idea of suddenly joining with the machine, comes in, and how that, enters the conversation of apotheosis, it's certainly one of the answers. And in that regard, like, I'm okay with it. Like, what I mean by that is, no, I don't want to do it. But what I mean by that is, like, if that's one path for certain people to achieve apotheosis, or, I've said this a million times before, like all of the, like, the hyper pro AI people, if you want to have, your own little spot over here, by all means have it. Have your little hyper efficient civilization, like rock and fucking roll. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Okay. Maybe the hyper naturalists can be over here, the people in between, like we can all have different ways. Part of the problem is that we live in this, present global civilization. And it really is like a global civilization that is artificially, propped up, by varying groups. We'll just put it that way. I'll be gentle with that. That makes us all kind of play by the same rules that most of us don't know. Right. But that makes us play by the same rules. And so we're not allowed to really experiment with, with different entire ways of organizing and living. And that's a shame. Okay. So I want to be clear on that. And it fits very much in with Gene Roddenberry's overall point that, like, Star Trek doesn't paint the bad guy as the bad guy. Yeah, they may be the antagonist, but they don't paint the bad guy as the bad guy. So regardless of path chosen, the point of Star Trek and why Star Trek still has value, I still have one more thing to get into, and why Star Trek still has value is because its ultimate message is apotheosis. Its ultimate message is bringing humanity, or at least the individual, right? Because Star Trek 3 corrected that problem. Okay. And this is one of the things where that's why I say there's separate paths, because Star Trek 2 is all, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. Okay. But then Star Trek 3, led and directed by Leonard Nimoy, Kabbalist, Star Trek 3 says no. sometimes the needs of the few or the one outweigh the needs of the many. And I would argue Star Trek can hold space for both. So now, how did this through line, as we've shown over and over again, occurs? Ultimately representative of Spock, right? How does this through line like stick around for 50 years? Now, the easy answer is basically that, like, the writers understood the mission. You know, whoever it ended up being, whether it was, you know, Brannon or maybe Jerry Taylor or, you know, like whoever, they got it. It's a possibility that's you know, that's what it was. It's just that the writing room understood this is what Star Trek is about. This is, you know, what you're going to deliver. Or, I mean, it can just be as much, it can even be unconscious in that, you know, when you listen to, and everybody should, when you listen to the commentaries on the physical discs, which everybody should own, of, you know, of the varying Star Trek series, original series and Next Generation in particular, or should I say not original series, but Next Generation in particular, and even going into DS9 and Voyager. But when you listen to the commentaries from people like Ronald D. Moore, and far be it for me to say something nice about him, but you can listen to them and you can hear how big of fans they were of the original series. You know, they were making the Next Generation, but it wasn't the monster yet. You know, the Next Generation wasn't the biggest thing on Earth yet, and they're just making it. And so what were they fans of? They're fans of the original series. And we can just as easily say, without getting into any occultism, mysticism, or spirituality, anything like that, is that the people working on the Next Generation wanted to work on the Next Generation because they loved Star Trek, and either consciously or unconsciously, they also understood what Star Trek was about. That Star Trek was about the human becoming like gods. So, yeah, I mean, even that is like answer enough for why that would keep occurring. Though I would also say this, I would also add this in. We've already gone plenty long enough. If you want me to discuss something more, I'll discuss more. But I don't think we have to spend a ton of time on this. But I'm reminded of, you know, there's an idea that and this is an idea that goes beyond simple poetry, but actually, you know, would seem to have scientific basis, if that matters to you. That the universe runs on narratives. It runs on story. And that this story can't help itself but weave itself through time, through space and time, or whatever actually comprises the universe. You know, if we were to quote the Traveler, right, space, time, thought are all one thing. They're not separate things. So what does that make it? Now in Kabbalah, we would say it's the Ein Sof, right? The goddess that exists outside of actually space and time. And we would go so far as to say that the goddess speaks through art. Like art is the at the core of what being human is. And that the goddess, like, will spread those truths through that art. Whether you know, whether you're consciously or unconsciously doing it, it's going to push it out there. And maybe because Star Trek, perhaps more than any other, you know, franchise, some people might want to bring up Star Wars. There's certainly some validity to that, though that's a completely separate conversation and a very nuanced and complex one, especially when you bring in the prequels of how spiritual exactly is it. Regardless, okay, I can't think of another franchise really that was actually largely unawares, I would say, because I've been around for a long time and talked to a lot of Star Trek fans and they don't get it, not consciously. That has such a deep spiritual root. Like I said earlier, it's amazing how many like pastors will quote Star Trek. It's amazing how many people in spiritual realms, or, you know, in the in spiritual circles, I guess I'll say, will quote Star Trek without even realizing that it is genuinely, deeply, in a Rosicrucian sense at least, deeply spiritual. Though I would argue more. It was an opportunity for the goddess, for the source, if you're more comfortable with that term, source, for source to speak. It makes me, think of Nietzsche, right? Friedrich Nietzsche, where in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he, brilliantly said that there's more wisdom in your body than in all of your philosophies. That is so spot on. And we know just from, Andromeda, the show Andromeda, which was based on a Gene Roddenberry some kind of script, right? One of the central species within Andromeda was the Nietzscheans. I mean, Gene Roddenberry would do this over and over again. It's more of the point that the Vulcans were meant to represent a type of person. Because you have when you look at Genesis 2, the pilot made by Gene Roddenberry, where you have where they were called the Tyrannids or something like that, which they're tyrants. Like Gene's, it's so funny because Gene's at one sense is being really deep, and then the other, he's not deep at all. He's slapping you across the face with this stuff. If you know it, if you recognize it, right? But if you didn't know the word tyrant, you wouldn't realize what he was saying. And it was so funny because he even had his own wife playing the queen of the tyrants. Anyway, go watch Genesis 2. But in Andromeda, right, one of the major species besides the humans, or they're they're actually very much like a Khan Noonien Singh type species, are called the Nietzscheans. So he's very aware of Nietzsche and would seem to have been fond of him, which, as am I, as, perhaps anybody should be, albeit Nietzsche being a very complex character. And, his sister actually wrote all the Nazi shit, so throw that stuff away. Hopefully people know that. Anyway. But Nietzsche made it really clear, and he's not wrong. He was such a deep thinker and just someone who so deeply understood things, in that your body just knows the truth. That's why we react so strongly to when we watch great Star Trek. Everything before 2017. That's why people get so, as annoying as the angry nerd bros are online, at the same time, I do understand where they're coming from. Because they feel like their own sense of truth is being attacked. Now they get confused because they're like, "Oh, Star Trek's not woke. Star Trek's not," and Star Trek's not. It's not corporate woke anyway. Star Trek is so beyond woke. When you understand everything I've just told you after the keys I've given you with the concept of Vulcan, it's so beyond that, it hurts. So those claiming it's not woke or that it's woke are both wrong. You don't even see what was, I hope by now to you, clearly was being laid out with this show. The actual ideology, what Star Trek is actually about. And so how does that message keep traveling over different creative teams, different writers, different whatever? It kept traveling because when you, whatever it was, whether it was stepping onto the set of Star Trek, whatever it was, you were just brought into that field of the source, that field of the goddess that was laying down that truth that your body already knows. That why am I here? Right? The big questions that Star Trek the Motion Picture was asking. Is this all that I am? Is there nothing more? Right? That's what V'ger asks. Star Trek is an answer. I've brought this up so many times over the years. Speaking of Star Trek the Motion Picture. When Star Trek the Motion Picture was coming out, it was very common for comic book companies to do a deal with Hollywood and okay, we'll put out a graphic novel version of whatever movie you're making, things like that. This was something that was becoming a thing. It's done for Star Wars, obviously. And Marvel ended up doing it for Star Trek the Motion Picture. And this is a big deal. And you can actually get your hands, I don't think it's very expensive, on a facsimile copy of issue 1 of Star Trek the Motion Picture from, 1979. And there's essays at the back of issue number 1. And one of the essays ends with this just beautiful point. Essentially saying, I mean, and it's pretty much word for word. We need Star Trek now because it is representative of our salvation. Whoever that writer was got everything I just told you. Why would you use a word, a spiritually loaded term, a religiously loaded term like salvation in this context? And that's because it's exactly what it is. They got it. Consciously or unconsciously, they got everything I just told you. It's not our salvation. Like Star Trek itself is not our salvation. I mean, it's more than a TV show, but it is still a TV show. It's not our salvation, but it is representative of our salvation. And I think everything we just talked about, once again, proves that point. However, that message kept getting carried down. It doesn't even have to be, you don't have to believe in the Ein Sof. You don't have to believe in that, the narrative of the universe travels through the human body and shows itself in art. You don't have to believe any of that. It could, again, I already told you, it could just as simply be that Star Trek fans unconsciously understood what the Rosicrucians were putting down, and they just carried it on until we get to the point in 2017 when Kurtzman and others clearly didn't understand, were blinded, or were too busy with who knows what to truly grok what Star Trek was saying and what Star Trek was about. And you wonder, like, why does Star Trek suck today? That's why. Why is Star Trek dying? That's why. But the fortunate thing is we have so much Star Trek that we can just, like any great book, we can just revisit it forever and see ourselves in the struggles of all these great characters. That is something worth celebrating. And in that regard, whatever part Gene Roddenberry played in injecting, this message of being more than you ever thought you could be, this message of becoming, of apotheosis, whatever Gene Roddenberry, whatever part he played in that, he deserves an absolute round of applause for. And I think I'll leave that there. So, if you disagree with me, YouTube comments, Spotify comments, Rumble comments, catch me on X at SOV64, SOV64. Come at me if you disagree with me. I think that this is a pretty open and shut case. So, if you'd like, go back. Watch some of the, I mean, we mentioned a bunch of episodes here. Go back, or movies even. Go back and watch them. And in fact, all right, I promise this is the end. Where Star Trek really should have ended, I mean, I like Star Trek Enterprise. I'm glad that exists, ultimately. But where Star Trek really should have ended was Star Trek Insurrection. I know you think it's a terrible movie. Now, I know I have a lot of new listeners here. No. Understand everything I just told you and then go watch that. Because that is Star Trek coming full circle. Where it's like, oh yeah, technology, science, technology, boom. And then, wait a minute. There's an entire universe in just a moment in time. And, what is everything? What is, once again, proving the point. What is the entire crux of that film, right? That the Sona and Starfleet even, or the Federation even, what do they want? They want immortality, which is the exact goal of the Atma / Rosicrucian Vulcan spirit man concept. It all comes back to immortality. Star Trek should have ended right there. And I need to end right here. So with all of that said, I'll see all of you, on the other side.